She was 21 and homeless, no family left in the county, no savings, just a canvas rucksack with 2 hammers and a silver disc inside it, and $1 she had earned washing dishes at a restaurant in Traverse City. And with that $1, she bought an abandoned silversmith's workshop on a lane in northern Michigan in a stretch of Leelanau County that had not heard a raising hammer since the workshop had closed in 1947. The fieldstone walls had gone dark with lichen, the forge chimney was cold, the oak workbench was covered in 77 years of dust and silence. But what nobody in the county knew, not the clerk who stamped the deed, not the neighbors on the cherry farms below the bluff, not even the old man in Petoskey, who would come looking for what was inside, was that hidden behind the crucible wall of that workshop was something that would start a war between two families over a dead man's tools and force a 21-year-old girl with nothing to answer a question that most people never have to face. Who owns what the dead leave behind, the blood that carries the name or the hand that carries the craft? This is the story of Ren Solberg, a silversmith who had $1, 2 hammers, and 500 blows between her and the answer. But before we get to the workshop, before the key and the crucible wall and the letter from a dead man, we need to go back 15 years to a cherry farm on a bluff above Grand Traverse Bay, where a 6-year-old girl sat on a wooden stool beside her grandmother's workbench and learned the first lesson of silversmithing without knowing she was learning anything at all. The farm belonged to Ingrid Solberg, 60 acres of Montmorency cherry on the high ground above the bay, the trees planted in rows that followed the contour of the bluff, their branches trained low for picking their roots deep in the sandy loam that the glaciers had left 10,000 years ago. The farmhouse was white clapboard with a green tin roof. The barn was red, and inside the barn against the south wall where the afternoon light came through a pair of tall windows was the workshop. Not a jeweler's shop, not a retail counter with glass cases and fluorescent lights. A silversmith's workshop, a forge built of fire brick and fed with coke, a heavy oak workbench with a bench vise bolted to the right end and a row of stake holes drilled into the top, an anvil, a pitch bed, a quenching bucket, and on the wall above the bench hung on iron nails driven into the timber frame the tools: raising hammers, planishing hammers, chasing punches, stakes of every profile, mushroom and mandrel and cow tongue and beak, each one a different curve for a different stage of a different form. Ingrid Solberg had been a silversmith for 31 years, not a jeweler who sold factory-made pieces from a display case. Ingrid had been a smith, a person who started with a flat disc of sterling silver cut from sheet stock about the thickness of a nickel and using only a hammer and a stake, and a forge transformed the flat disc into a 3-dimensional vessel, a bowl, a cup, a pitcher, a vase, by the ancient process called raising. Raising was the repeated striking of the metal over a curved stake, each blow pushing the silver inward and upward, the disc gradually becoming a cylinder, the cylinder gradually becoming a curve, the curve gradually becoming a form, the form gradually becoming a vessel, 1 hammer blow at a time, 500 blows to raise a simple cup, 2,000 to raise a pitcher, each blow deliberate, each blow in the same place relative to the last. The disc rotating 15 degrees between each strike so that the blows traveled around the circumference in a spiral, each round lifting the wall a little higher, a little closer to the shape the smith held in her mind. And the sound, the specific bright ringing sound of a polished steel hammer striking a sheet of sterling silver on a polished steel stake, not the clang of a blacksmith's hammer on iron, not the thud of a carpenter's hammer on wood. A ring, clear and high and musical like a bell struck once and left to vibrate.
The sound traveled across the workshop and through the barn walls and out into the cherry orchard, and on a still summer morning you could hear it from the farmhouse porch, faint and steady, the rhythm of a woman making something beautiful out of something flat. That was the sound Ren Solberg grew up with. Not every day, not even every month, but every summer from the age of 5 and every school break from the age of 7. Ren had been sent from her mother's apartment in Grand Rapids to Ingrid's farm on the bluff, and the sound of the hammer on silver was the sound of arriving. Her mother's apartment smelled of mint fluoride and latex gloves. Her mother, Maren, was a dental assistant, a quiet woman who worked 5 days a week in a clinic on Division Avenue and came home tired and smelling of other people's mouths. Maren had left Leelanau County at 20. She had moved to Grand Rapids, married a man named Brian who sold insurance, and had Ren. Brian had left Maren for a younger woman when Ren was 5. Maren had raised Ren alone on the assistant's salary, and the apartment was clean and small and adequate, and Maren was a good mother in every way that could be measured. She fed Ren, she clothed Ren, she helped with homework, she showed up at school events. But Maren did not make things. Maren's hands were clinical hands, gloved hands, hands that held suction tubes and passed instruments and never touched anything that rang when you struck it. And the apartment, for all its cleanliness, had no forge smell, no pitch smell, no sweet tang of hot silver and flux. It had the smell of a life maintained, not a life made. The farm was the opposite. The farm was where things were made, and the making was loud and hot and physical. And the woman who made them was Ingrid, who was 65 years old when Ren first sat on the stool beside the workbench, and who had 4 arms like a carpenter from 3 decades of raising, and who wore a leather apron over a flannel shirt, and who looked at her granddaughter with eyes that were already deciding what to teach her first. The first lesson was not about hammering, the first lesson was about looking. Ingrid took a raised bowl from the shelf above the workbench, one of Harald's bowls made in 1935 by Ren's great-grandfather, the man who had started everything. Harald Solberg had come to northern Michigan from a village outside Gothenburg in 1919, a young Swedish silversmith who had immigrated because a cousin had written that the cherry orchards of Leelanau County needed farmhands, and because the silversmithing he had trained for in Sweden had no market in a farming county in Michigan. Harald had picked cherries for 3 years before he set up a small forge in the barn and began making silver pieces on the side. Spoons at first, because spoons were simple and the cherry farmers' wives needed spoons, then forks and serving pieces, and then bowls. By 1930, Harald had stopped picking cherries because the silver work was paying more than the farm work, because Harald's silver was Swedish silver made by hand in the Swedish tradition, with the clean, simple lines and the understated ornament that the Swedish smiths had been refining for 300 years. And the clean, simple lines had appealed to the Scandinavian and German families who populated Leelanau County, because clean, simple lines were what they had grown up with and what they trusted. Harald had taught his daughter Ingrid to raise when she was 8 years old. He had given her a 3-inch disc of sterling silver, clamped a racing stake in the bench vise, and put the hammer in her hand. By the time Ingrid was grown, she had taken over the workshop. Harald had died in the late 1940s, but the tradition continued. Ingrid had refined what her father had taught her, and the silver kept flowing from the barn on the bluff for 3 decades. Now Ingrid turned the bowl upside down and held it under the light. "Look at the marks," she said. Ren looked. The bottom of the bowl was covered in small overlapping dimples, each one about the size of a dime, arranged in a spiral pattern from the center to the rim. "Each mark is a hammer blow," Ingrid said. "See how they overlap? Each blow is about the size of a dime. The blows go around the bowl in a spiral from the bottom to the lip. The spiral tells you how the smith raised the bowl. He started at the bottom and worked his way up, each round raising the wall a little higher. Count the rounds. Wren counted 12 rounds, she told Ingrid. 12 rounds, Ingrid said. About 40 blows per round, 480 blows, and the marks are even, the same size, the same depth, the same spacing. That means Harald hit with the same force every time for 480 blows. That's not strength, that's control. Wren was 6. She did not understand control, but she understood the marks. She could see them, she could count them, she could see that they were even, and she could see that evenness meant something even if she did not yet know what. That was the beginning, not of silversmithing, of seeing. By 8, Wren could recognize the difference between a raised mark and a planished mark. The raised mark was a deep dimple with sharp edges, the record of a single blow from the raising hammer, its cross-peen face biting into the silver at an angle. The planished mark was a shallow compression with soft edges, the record of a finishing blow from the planishing hammer, its flat polished face pressing the dimple smooth. The raising puts the marks on, Ingrid told her. The planishing takes the marks off, but the planishing doesn't undo the raising. The planishing perfects it. The vessel is the same vessel, the same shape, the same wall thickness, the same curve. The marks are the only thing that changes. The marks go from rough to smooth. The hand goes from making to finishing. By 10, Ingrid had put the hammer in Wren's hand. Hold it at the end of the handle, Ingrid said. Not the middle, the end. The handle is a lever. The longer the lever, the less force you need. Strike with the wrist, not the arm. The wrist gives you control. The arm gives you only force. And force without control is just noise. Wren struck the disc. The hammer hit the stake with a dull thud. She had missed the silver entirely. You hit the stake, Ingrid said. That's better than hitting the air. Hit the silver this time, where the edge of the disc meets the top of the stake, not the center. The center stays flat until the edges come up. Wren struck again. This time the hammer caught the edge of the disc, and the silver moved just slightly, bending downward over the curve of the stake. And the sound was not a thud, it was a ring, small and thin, but a ring. There, Ingrid said, that's the sound, remember it. Wren remembered it. She remembered it the way you remember a sound that enters your body through your hand before it reaches your ears. The vibration traveling up the hammer handle through her wrist into her arm, and the ring arriving a fraction of a second later, confirming what her hand had already felt. The silver had moved, the blow had landed, the sound had said so. By 12, Wren could raise a simple ball from a 3-inch disc. The same exercise Harald had given Ingrid and that Harald's father had given Harald in Gothenburg before he had come to Michigan. The ball was even and symmetrical, the wall consistent, the marks clean. Not perfect, but competent. The work of a child who had been taught by a woman, who had been taught by a man, who had been taught by a tradition that was 300 years old. At 14, Ingrid taught her to anneal. Annealing was the most important concept in silversmithing, and the concept was simple, but the consequences of ignoring it were absolute. Silver was a soft metal, but it hardened when it was hammered. The repeated impact of the hammer compressed the crystal structure of the metal, a process called work hardening, and the soft yielding silver became stiff and brittle. A disc that had been hammered for 10 minutes without annealing would crack on the 11th minute because the metal had become too hard to move. Annealing was the remedy, heating the silver to about 1100 degrees Fahrenheit with a torch or in a forge until it glowed a dull red, then quenching it in water. The heat reorganized the crystal structure and the metal became soft again, ready for more hammering. A silversmith who was raising a vessel had to anneal every 3 or 4 rounds to keep the metal workable. The silver tells you when it needs to be annealed, Ingrid told Wren on a July afternoon at the workbench, the forge radiating heat across the barn floor, the cherry trees visible through the open door, heavy with fruit. The hammer changes sound when the silver is soft, the hammer rings. When the silver is hard, the hammer pings. Ring is ready, ping is tired. When you hear ping, stop hammering and anneal. If you keep hammering past ping, the silver cracks. And the cracked vessel cannot be repaired, it can only be melted and started over. Ran heated a work-hardened disc with Ingrid's torch until it glowed dull red. She quenched it in the bucket. She picked it up and felt the difference immediately. The stiff, resistant metal became soft and yielding, the hammer sinking into the surface instead of bouncing off it. It was like the metal had exhaled. The anneal is the reset, Ingrid said. Every 3 rounds, the silver needs to rest. The crystals need to reorganize. If you don't let the silver rest, the silver breaks. Patience is not optional. Patience is structural. Ren was 14 when she heard that, and she filed it away the way a 14-year-old files away a grandmother's words, which is to say, she heard it and she understood it and she did not yet know how much she would need it. At 16, Wren built her first complete piece. A small silver cup raised from a 4-inch disc, planished smooth, the lip turned with a beading tool, the bottom stamped with her own hallmark. A small crowned W following the family tradition. Harald's hallmark had been a crowned H. Ingrid's had been a crowned I. The crown was the nod to the Swedish tradition and the initial was the Smith. The hallmark is your name on the work, Ingrid told Wren, holding the finished cup to the light and turning it slowly. You press your name into the silver and the silver carries your name for 100 years. 200 years, 500 years. There are hallmarks on medieval silver that are still reliable today. When you put your mark on a piece, you are saying, I made this, I am responsible for this. If this piece is good, my name is good. If this piece is poor, my name is poor. The hallmark is not decoration, the hallmark is accountability. Ingrid looked at the cup, the wall thickness even, the lip clean, the hallmark sharp. She turned it once more in the light, and Wren watched her grandmother's face, looking for judgment, looking for approval, looking for the thing a 16-year-old looks for in a grandmother's eyes when she has just finished the hardest thing she has ever made. Your great-grandfather would have sold this, Ingrid said. That's the standard. Those summers on the bluff were the architecture of Wren's life. Not school in Grand Rapids, not the apartment on Division Avenue, not the fluoride-scented routine of Maren's careful world. The summers, the barn, the forge, the hammer, Ingrid's voice naming each technique, the way a priest names sacraments with weight and reverence, and the expectation that the student would carry the knowledge forward. Ingrid had also told Wren about Leif Dahl, not often, not in detail, but enough. On summer evenings, the two of them sitting on the porch watching the light change over Grand Traverse Bay, Ingrid would mention the name the way you mention a cathedral you once visited with awe. The time had not diminished. There was a man named Leif Dahl, Ingrid had said once, rocking slowly in the porch chair, her hands resting on the arms, the hands of a smith, calloused and strong. He was the finest silversmith in northern Michigan, better than my father, better than anyone. He had a workshop on a bluff above the bay, a fieldstone building with a forge and a chimney, and he raised silver there for 46 years, from 1901 until he died in 1947. Ingrid had paused, looking out at the bay. My father said Leif could hear the thickness of the wall by the sound of the hammer. Thick silver sounds dull, thin silver sounds bright. Leif kept the wall at exactly 20 gauge, about 32 thousandths of an inch, by listening to the hammer and adjusting his force. He didn't use a micrometer, he used his ears. 2 years after Wren built her first cup, Ingrid was dead. A quiet death at the farm on a Saturday morning in November. She had been sitting at the workbench with a half-raised bowl on the stake. a 5-inch cherry blossom bowl she had been making for the Sutton's Bay gift shop, the walls about 2/3 up, the silver end kneeled and ready for the next round. The raising hammer was in her hand. She had been mid-stroke. The doctor said it was her heart. Quick, probably painless. Ingrid had been 88 years old, and the heart that had driven her arms through 31 years of raising had simply stopped. Ren, who was 18 and who had driven up from Grand Rapids the night before because something in her had said go, arrived at the farm at 9 in the morning and found Ingrid at the bench, still holding the hammer, the bowl still on the stake, the forge still warm. Ren had stood in the doorway of the barn and looked at her grandmother and had not made a sound. She had walked to the bench and had looked at the half-raised bowl and had seen in the marks on the silver exactly where Ingrid had stopped. The last blow was a clean mark on the upper wall about a 1/4 inch below the lip line. A good blow, a controlled blow. The last thing Ingrid's hand had done in this life was land a hammer blow exactly where it needed to land. Ren took 3 things from the workshop before Maren arrived: the raising hammer, the planishing hammer, and a silver disc that Harald had cut in 1945 and that had never been raised. A flat circle of sterling silver, 80 years old, waiting. She took them because they were hers. Not legally, not by will or deed, but by the only law that mattered in a silversmith's workshop. They belonged to the hand that knew how to use them. Then Maren sold the farm. Not immediately, not cruelly. Maren had debts. The dental clinic had cut her hours. There was a second mortgage on the apartment in Grand Rapids. And the farm, 60 acres on a bluff above Grand Traverse Bay, with views of the Manitou Islands, was worth more money than Maren had ever seen in her life. But the way she sold it was the wound. Maren sold the farm to a real estate holding company based in Traverse City. She signed the papers in February, 3 months after Ingrid's death. The cherry trees were bare. The workshop was locked. The tools Ren had not taken were still on the walls. The forge was cold, and the half-raised cherry blossom bowl was still on the stake where Ingrid had left it, the hammer mark still sharp, the silver still waiting for the next blow that would never come. Ren found out about the sale from a voicemail, not a conversation, not a phone call where her mother said, "I need to talk to you about the farm." A voicemail, 32 seconds, Maren's voice flat and tired. "The farm sold. The closing is next week. I kept some of your grandmother's things in a box. You can pick them up when you have time." Ren did not pick up the box. She did not call Maren back. She stood in the parking lot behind the restaurant in Traverse City where she washed dishes for $12 an hour and listened to the voicemail twice, and then put her phone in her pocket and went back inside and washed dishes for 6 more hours and did not let herself think about it because thinking was not useful and the thing she needed right now was work. The apartment in Grand Rapids had been next. Ren had been renting a room in a shared place near the restaurant, splitting rent with 2 other workers. When the lease ended, the other tenants moved out and Ren could not afford the rent alone. She had been washing dishes for 5 months. She had saved almost nothing. She had no car. She had no family in the county willing to take her in. Maren was in Grand Rapids, and the distance between Ren and Maren was not measured in miles. She was homeless for 3 weeks. She slept at a shelter in Traverse City for the first week, then in the break room of the restaurant for the second week because the night manager looked the other way, then on a bench at the marina for the third week because it was September and the nights were still warm enough if you had a sleeping bag, which she did, rolled tight and strapped to the bottom of her rucksack. The rucksack held everything: the sleeping bag, a change of clothes, Ingrid's raising hammer, Ingrid's planishing hammer, Harald's unraised disc, and $1. She had earned $1 that morning. A customer at the restaurant had left a single bill on the counter beside a stack of dirty plates, and the busser had said, "That's yours if you want it. Nobody tips the dishwasher." Wren had taken the dollar and put it in her pocket and walked out into the September light and started walking towards Sutton's Bay because she had nowhere else to go, and Sutton's Bay was where Ingrid's farm had been. And walking toward the place you lost is what you do when you have nothing left. She saw the listing at the post office, a photocopied county surplus notice on the community board beside the mailboxes, yellowed, half hidden behind a flyer for a cherry festival that had ended 2 months ago. She almost missed it. She would have missed it if the cherry festival flyer had not been curling at the corner, peeling away from the pushpin, revealing the notice beneath it. Leelanau County Surplus, Silversmith's Workshop, Dull Lane, $1, Inquire Clerk's Office. She read it twice. She read it 3 times. She pulled the notice from the board and held it in both hands and read it again. $1. $1 for a silversmith's workshop in Leelanau County, on a lane she had never heard of, but in a county where her grandmother had raised silver for 31 years and her great-grandfather had raised silver before that. Nobody had taken the notice down. Nobody had inquired. She walked to the Leelanau County Clerk's office in Leland the next morning. 7 miles from Sutton's Bay along the lake road, the maples turning copper, the bay dark blue through the gaps in the trees. She arrived at 9 when the office opened. The clerk was a woman in her 50s named Mrs. Lindquist, with reading glasses on a chain and a cardigan the color of Lake Michigan in October. Mrs. Lindquist looked at the notice, she looked at Wren, she looked at the dollar Wren placed on the counter. She stamped the deed and handed Wren an iron key on a loop of silver wire. "The Dahl workshop on the bluff," Mrs. Lindquist said. "Leif Dahl's daughter brought this key to this office in 1948 and said give it to whoever hears the hammer. Nobody ever asked." She looked at Wren again, something in her eyes shifting. "Solberg," Mrs. Lindquist said, reading the name on the deed. "Ingrid Solberg was your grandmother." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Lindquist set down her pen. "Ingrid made the christening cup for my daughter in 1991. My daughter is 35 now, and the cup is on her mantle. The hallmark, the crown and eye, is still sharp. The silver has never been polished. Ingrid said that if you raise a cup correctly and plenish it correctly, the surface is so dense that oxygen cannot penetrate. And silver that oxygen cannot penetrate does not tarnish." She paused. 35 years and the silver still shines. Wren held the key. The iron was cold. The loop of silver wire was warm from Mrs. Lindquist's hand. "Can I ask you something?" Mrs. Lindquist said. "Can you raise silver the way Ingrid did?" "Yes, ma'am," Wren said. "She taught me." Mrs. Lindquist nodded slowly. "Then the key is where it belongs." Wren hitched a ride to the lane that afternoon. A cherry farmer heading north on M22 dropped her at the turn of a gravel track that climbed the bluff through a stand of white birch. The workshop stood at the top of the lane, a fieldstone building with a slate roof, a forge chimney on the east end, and a heavy plank door with iron strap hinges. Grand Traverse Bay was visible through the birch trees to the west, dark blue in the late September light. The Manitou Islands sat on the horizon like two sleeping animals. Wren put the key in the lock. The iron mechanism resisted, then turned. The door swung inward on hinges that groaned with 77 years of rust. One room, fieldstone walls, a flagstone floor, heavy timber beams overhead, black with age and smoke. Against the east wall, the forge stone firebox with a bellows housing and a chimney hood, cold and dark. The firebrake cracked in places but solid. Against the north wall, the workbench, heavy oak slab with a bench vise frozen with corrosion and a set of stake holes drilled into the top. Against the west wall, a pitcher bed on a wrought iron stand, and against the south wall, the crucible wall. A section of the fieldstone about 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall that was different from the rest. The stones were smoother, more carefully fitted and blackened with the soot of decades of forge work. The crucible shelf, a stone ledge built into the wall at waist height, protruded about 6 inches. Wren walked the room slowly. She touched the workbench. She touched the vise. She touched the stake holes, each one a round socket drilled into the oak for holding a different stake. She counted 7 holes, a full raising setup. Whoever had worked here had been serious. She stood at the forge and looked into the firebox and smelled the ghost of coke smoke in the firebrick, faint but present the way a church holds the smell of incense long after the last service. She looked at the chimney hood and saw the draw marks in the soot, the pattern that told you whether a chimney pulled clean or sluggish. The mark said clean. This forge had been well built. Then she went to the crucible wall. She did not know why. She did not know there was anything behind it. She went because the wall was different and because she had been trained by Ingrid to notice when something was different, and the crucible shelf protruded in a way that seemed deliberate, like a handle waiting to be pulled. She ran her hand along the crucible shelf. The stone was smooth under her fingers, worn by decades of crucibles being set down, and picked up the surface glazed with a thin residue of melted flux. The shelf moved, not the whole shelf. The front face of the shelf, a fetid stone slab about 18 inches wide, shifted outward under her hand, a quarter inch, then a half inch, then an inch. She gripped the edge and pulled. The slab came free. Behind it was a cavity, a space about 2 feet deep, 18 inches wide, and a foot tall, lined with fire brick, sealed from the heat of the forge by the thick filled stone wall. The fire brick was clean, no soot, no moisture. The cavity had been airtight for 77 years. Inside the cavity, wrapped in a chamois cloth that had gone stiff with age but had not rotted, were a leather tool roll, a heavy canvas pouch, and a thick leather-bound book. Wren's hands were shaking. Her hands had never shaken when she held a hammer, because the hammer was steady work, and steady work calmed the body. But this was not steady work, this was discovery, and discovery made the hands tremble. She lifted the tool roll first, untied the leather thong, unrolled it on the workbench. A matched set of silversmith's tools. A raising hammer with a crossed pin face, the steel polished, the handle dark with age and use. A planishing hammer with a mirror-polished face so flat and true that she could see her own eye reflected in it. A set of 12 chasing punches in graduated profiles, dots, lines, curves, leaves. A pair of silver soldering tongs with insulated handles, a jeweler's torch tip for precision soldering, and a hallmark stamp, a small crowned L engraved in steel. Each tool was stamped on the shaft 2 words, Dahl, L. Leif Dahl, the finest silversmith in northern Michigan, 46 years of racing. These were his tools, hidden behind the crucible wall since 1947. Beside the tool roll, wrapped separately in a square of silk that had yellowed but not frayed, was a single finished piece. A silver serving spoon about 10 inches long, the bowl raised from a single disc, the handle forged and tapered, the junction between bowl and handle invisible because Leif had forged them from one piece, not soldered 2 pieces together. The surface was planished to a mirror finish. The crowned L hallmark was pressed into the back of the handle, the edges sharp and clean after 77 years. The canvas pouch held coins. Wren loosened the drawstring and tilted the pouch. Gold. 35 Liberty Quarter eagles dated between 1901 and 1946. She did not know what they were worth. She knew they were gold. She knew gold was heavy. The pouch was heavy. The book was a pattern book, page after page of hand-drawn templates for every piece Leif Dahl had made across 46 years of smithing. Each page showed the flat disc size, the finished dimensions, the raising sequence number of rounds, blows per round, the annealing schedule, the planishing sequence, the chasing pattern, if the piece was decorated, and a one-line quality note in small, precise handwriting. May 3rd, 1928, Cherry Blossom Bowl, 6-inch disc, 14 rounds, 42 blows per round, anneal every 3 rounds, planish 200 blows, chase 4 blossoms on outside. The silver from the Traverse City refiner is cleaner this year, raises without cracking. Best bowl of the season, 46 years of silver, thousands of pieces, everyone recorded. The pattern book was the structural memory of the workshop. Then Wren turned to a page near the middle of the book, dated June 1945, and her hand stopped trembling and went still. June 14, 1945, Ingrid Solberg, age 10, to the workshop today. Harald sent her to learn raising pitcher. Says the girl has outgrown bowls. Hands steady, eyes focused, showed her the 2000 blow sequence. She watched without speaking for 20 minutes. Then she asked the right question. She asked why the 15th round changes angle. Harald has reached his limit and knows it. He is sending his daughter to learn what he cannot teach. I will teach her. Wren read the entry 3 times. Leif Dahl had taught Ingrid. Harald, her great-grandfather, had known his own limitations and had sent his 10-year-old daughter to the best silversmith in the county to learn what he could not teach. Ingrid had never told Wren this. Ingrid had spoken of Leif Dahl as a legend, a distant figure. She had never said he taught me. She had never said your great-grandfather sent me to him because he knew I needed more than he could give. The humility of Harald, sending his daughter away to learn from someone better, and the silence of Ingrid, who had kept the secret for nearly 80 years. Because the lesson was not about who taught you, the lesson was about what you learned. And what Ingrid had learned, she had passed to Wren, and the chain was unbroken, and the source did not need a name. She turned the page. June 15th, 1945, second day with the Solberg girl, showed her the annealing sequence for picture walls. She asked why the third anneal is hotter than the first two. I told her the walls are thinner by the third round and thin walls need more heat to reorganize without warping. She nodded once. She understood. This girl will be better than her father. She may be better than me. Wren closed the book. Her hands were still. The workshop was quiet. The September light from the doorway fell across the workbench and the tools and the silver spoon and the pattern book, and the dust motes turned slowly in the light, and Wren Solberg was 21 years old and homeless and holding the tools of a dead man she had never met but whose craft she carried in her hands because a woman named Ingrid had carried it first. Tucked inside the front cover of the pattern book was a folded letter. The paper was heavy cream-colored, the handwriting the same small, precise script as the pattern entries. To whoever finds this wall, my name is Leif Dahl. I have raised silver in this workshop from 1901 until today, the 9th of October 1947. I am 68 years old. The factories have come. They stamp silver vessels from sheet in a press, and the vessels all look the same. My vessels do not look the same. Each one carries the marks of my hammer before I plenish them away. And the marks are still in the metal even though you cannot see them because plenishing does not remove the marks. It absorbs them. I am leaving my tools and my savings and my pattern book and my last spoon behind the crucible wall because the wall is fire brick and fire brick does not burn. If you are reading this, you have found the wall. If you have found the wall, you were looking. If you were looking, you are a smith. Raise something. Leif Dahl, silversmith, October 9th, 1947. Wren folded the letter and placed it back inside the pattern book. She picked up the silver spoon, Leif's last piece, and turned it over. On the back of the handle, near the base, the hallmark. The small crowned L pressed into the silver with the steel stamp. The edges sharp and clean after 77 years because silver does not corrode, and a hallmark pressed into silver with the right force at the right temperature is permanent. She held the spoon in the September light from the doorway and looked at the hallmark and understood that this was the last mark Leif Dahl had made in this workshop, and the mark was still as sharp as the moment he had pressed it. Thank you, Mr. Dahl, she said quietly. I will raise something. She sold the coins the next week. A dealer in Traverse City, a careful man who examined each coin with a loupe and calculated the value based on gold weight and numismatic grade. $22,000, more money than Wren had ever touched. She deposited the check at the bank on Front Street and opened a checking account and walked out into the October light with a balance that would have seemed impossible a week ago. She bought a used truck, a 1999 Ford Ranger with 189,000 miles and cherry stain on the bed from a retired orchardist in Northport, $1,400. It started on the second try and the heater worked and the tires were decent and that was enough. The rest of the money she rationed carefully. Coke for the forge was not cheap and she would need it through the winter. Sheet silver for stock, refractory mortar for the firebox, food, gas. A winter's worth of supplies for a woman living alone in a stone building on a bluff above a frozen bay. $22,000 seemed like a fortune to a woman who had been sleeping on a marina bench a week ago, but Wren knew what Ingrid had taught her about silver, that it stretches only as far as the hammer allows, and money was the same. She budgeted the way she raised deliberately, one blow at a time, and she planned to make it last. Then she began. The forge and the chimney first. The bellows had rotted, and the chimney was choked with decades of soot and bird nests. She bought a new leather bellows from a blacksmith supply house in Traverse City for $55 and a chimney brush for $15. She swept the chimney herself, standing on the slate roof in the October wind, the brush plunging down into the dark flue, the soot falling in chunks into the firebox below. Mrs. Lindquist drove out to the lane one Saturday morning with a bucket of refractory mortar and helped Wren repoint the forge firebox. The two women worked side by side, pressing mortar between the fire bricks, sealing the cracks that 77 years of cold had opened. Leif Dahl made the communion set for the Suttons Bay Lutheran Church in 1929. Mrs. Lindquist said, smoothing mortar with a trowel, "A chalice, a paten, and two candlesticks. The church still uses them every Sunday. The hallmark on the chalice is as sharp today as the day he pressed it. 97 years. The silver has never been polished. Ingrid told me the planishing was so good the surface repels tarnish." Wren made the workshop livable in pieces. A folding army cot from the thrift store in Leland for $10 set against the west wall near the window that looked out through the birch trees toward Grand Traverse Bay. The forge was the heat source. Once lit, the stone firebox radiated warmth across the flagstone floor and into the walls, and the field stone held the heat for hours after the fire banked. A man named Mr. Tuomi, who ran the cherry orchard below the bluff, drove up the lane one Saturday with a box of supplies, a coffee pot, 2 enamel mugs, a skillet, a bag of dried cherries, a loaf of bread, a pound of butter. "Your grandmother made a silver pin for my wife's 50th birthday," Mr. Tommy said, setting the box on the workbench. "A cherry blossom, 5 petals, each one chased by hand. My wife wore it every day for 11 years until she died, and the pin is in her casket." She said Ingrid's silver was warm, not just the metal, the making. She said you could feel the hand in the silver. He came back every Saturday after that, sometimes with supplies, sometimes just to sit on the step and drink coffee and watch the light on the bay. He never asked what Wren was building. He seemed to understand that the building was not yet the point. The point was the preparing. She set up the workshop over the first month, oiling the bench vise until it moved freely, cleaning the stake holes in the workbench, and fitting new stakes she forged from mild steel on the restored forge. Arranging the pitch bed beside the west window where the afternoon light came in low and even for chasing work. She hung Harald's unraised disc on a nail beside the door, the disc she would raise when the workshop was ready, not before. The first fire she lit in the forge filled the workshop with a deep dry heat that radiated from the stone firebox and traveled across the flagstone floor. And the stone warmed and released the ghost scent of hot silver and flux and pitch that had been sealed in the walls for 77 years. And the workshop smelled for the first time since 1947 like a place where silver was being worked. Wren sat on the cot that night and watched the forge glow and listened to the silence and thought about Leif Dahl, who had stood at that forge for 46 years, and Ingrid, who had stood at hers for 31, and Harald, who had known his own limits and sent his daughter to learn from someone better.
The fire was the same fire. The forge was the same forge. The hammer would ring the same way. She placed both raising hammers on the workbench, Ingrid's and Leif's, side by side, both cross-peen, both worn smooth. She placed both hallmark stamps beside them, the crowned I and the crowned L. She opened the pattern book to the first entry, April 7th, 1901, first piece. Silver spoon from Flatstock, raised the bowl in 6 rounds, crude. The handle junction show solder visible, I will do better. Wren read the entry and smiled, because the first entry in the book of the finest silversmith in northern Michigan was a record of failure. And the last line was a promise. I will do better. She was still smiling when she heard the truck. The headlights came up the lane through the birch trees, cutting through the October dark, the engine low and steady. Not Mr. Tuomi's truck, not Mrs. Lindquist's sedan. A different vehicle, a newer vehicle, the kind of vehicle that did not belong on a gravel lane in Leelanau County at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. The truck stopped, the engine cut, a door opened and closed, footsteps on gravel, then a knock on the workshop door. 3 knocks, firm, patient. The knocks of a man who was used to doors being opened for him. Wren opened the door. The man standing on the step was about 70 years old. Tall, lean, white hair cut short, a wool coat over a flannel shirt. His face was weathered and angular, the face of a man who had spent time outdoors, but not recently. His eyes were blue and sharp, and he held himself with the straight-backed posture of a man who had opinions and the means to enforce them. My name is Gunnar Dahl, the man said. Leif Dahl was my grandfather. I've come for his tools. Wren did not step aside. She stood in the doorway with the forge light behind her and the October cold on her face and looked at the man who had just claimed ownership of everything she had found behind the crucible wall. How did you know? She said. Gunnar Dahl did not answer immediately. He looked past her into the workshop and his eyes moved across the room the way a man's eyes move across a place he has heard described but never seen. The forge glowing against the east wall, the workbench with the 2 hammers side by side, the pattern book open on the beam above. He was reading the room the way you read a letter from someone who died before you were born. Mrs. Lindquist called me, Gunnar said. She's the county clerk. She said someone bought the workshop, a young woman named Solberg. She thought I should know. Mrs. Lindquist gave me the key, Wren said. She gave you the key to the building, Gunnar said. The building is county surplus. You bought the building, but what's inside the wall is not the building. What's inside the wall is my grandfather's property, his tools, his pattern book, his savings, his last piece. Those are Dahl family property. They were hidden, not abandoned. Wren felt the words land the way a hammer blow lands on cold silver, hard, sharp, true in a way she did not want to acknowledge but could not deny. Your grandfather's letter said to give them to whoever finds the wall, Wren said. My grandfather's letter is not a legal document, Gunnar said. It's a letter written by a dying man who didn't know who would find it. He didn't mean a stranger, he meant a smith, he meant family. I am a smith, Wren said. Gunnar looked at her, the sharp blue eyes taking in her age, her clothes, the rucksack on the cot, the $1 deed on the workbench beside the hammers. She could see him calculating. A 21-year-old girl, homeless, alone in a dead man's workshop with a dead man's tools. You may be a smith, Gunnar said quietly, but you are not a doll, and those tools have my grandfather's name on them, everyone, stamped in the steel. Dahl L. That's my name, that's my family, I want them back. He did not raise his voice, he did not threaten. He stood on the step in the October cold with his hands in his coat pockets and stated his position the way a man states a position when he believes he is right and does not need volume to prove it. I'll give you a week to think about it, Gunnar said. I'm not trying to take your workshop. The building is yours, the forge is yours, the workbench is yours. I want the tools, the pattern book, the spoon, and the hallmark stamp. That's all. Those are my grandfather's legacy. They belong with his family. He turned and walked back to his truck. The engine started. The headlights swung through the birch trees and disappeared down the lane.
Wren closed the door and stood in the workshop with the forge crackling and the two hammers on the bench and the pattern book open above her and the crowned L hallmark stamp catching the firelight. She picked up the hallmark stamp and held it in her palm. The steel was cold. The crowned L was sharp and clean, engraved with the precision of a man who understood that the hallmark was permanent and therefore had to be perfect. Gunnar was right. The tools had his grandfather's name on them, every one, stamped in the steel. Dal L. But Leif's letter had said raise something, not return something, raise something. She did not sleep that night. She sat on the cot and watched the forge die down to embers and thought about ownership and inheritance and the distance between a name stamped on a tool and a hand that knew how to use it. And she thought about Ingrid, who had learned from Leif in this very workshop in 1945 and who had never told Wren about it and who had carried Leif's teaching forward for 31 years without ever saying his name. The teaching was in Wren's hands. The name was on the tools. And the question was which one mattered more. In the morning, she drove to the county library in Leland and looked up property law. The county surplus sale included the building and all contents. The deed said structure and appurtenances, which meant the building and everything attached to or contained within it. The tools had been inside the wall. The wall was part of the building. By the letter of the law, the tools were hers. But the law and the right were not always the same thing, and Wren knew it, and the knowing sat in her chest like a stone she could not swallow and could not spit out. She called Mrs. Lindquist from the payphone outside the library. He came to the workshop, Wren said. Gunnar Dahl, he wants the tools. Mrs. Lindquist was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know, he called me first. He asked me not to sell the workshop until he could inspect it. I told him the sale was already done. He was upset, not angry, upset. There's a difference. Is he right? Wren asked. Legally. I'm a clerk, not a lawyer, Mrs. Lindquist said. But the deed says what it says. You bought the building and its contents. What was inside the building at the time of sale is yours. She paused. But Wren, the law and the right aren't always the same thing. You know that. I know, Wren said. Gunnar Dahl is 70 years old, Mrs. Lindquist said. His grandfather died 9 years before Gunnar was born. He never met Leif. He never saw him raise silver. He never heard the hammer. All he has of his grandfather is the name and the stories his mother told him. Those tools are the only physical connection he has to a man he never knew. That's not nothing. Wren drove back to the workshop and sat at the workbench and opened the pattern book to the entry about Ingrid. June 14, 1945. Harald sent her to learn racing picture. She read it again, and she thought about a man in Gothenburg who had trained as a silversmith and come to Michigan and picked cherries for 3 years and who had reached the limit of what he could teach his daughter and had done the hardest thing a craftsman can do. He had sent her to someone better, not because he was weak, because he was honest, because he loved his daughter's potential more than he loved his pride. The week passed. Wren spent it working on the workshop and trying not to think about Gunnar Dahl, which was like trying not to think about the sound of a hammer when you are sitting in a silversmith's workshop surrounded by hammers. He was there in every tool, his name, his grandfather's name, Dahl. L stamped into the steel, permanent, unremovable, a claim that predated hers by 77 years. On the 7th day, she decided to raise Harald's disc. It was not a decision she made with her mind. It was a decision she made with her hands. She woke before dawn, and the forge was cold, and the workshop was grey with early light, and Harald's disc was hanging on the nail beside the door where she had placed it a month ago, waiting. And her hands wanted to work. Her hands had not raised silver in 3 years since the last summer at Ingrid's farm, and the hands remembered even when the mind was tangled with questions about ownership and law and a 70-year-old man's claim to a dead man's tools. She lit the forge. She waited for the coke to catch and the firebox to radiate. She took Harald's disc from the nail and held it in both hands. A 4-inch circle of sterling silver cut from sheet stock in 1945 by a Swedish immigrant silversmith who had picked cherries for 3 years before the silver paid more. The disc was 80 years old. It had never been struck. It had been waiting. She clamped Ingrid's steak in the bench vise. A mushroom steak with a gentle curve, the right profile for the first rounds of a bowl. She placed the disc on the steak. She picked up Ingrid's raising hammer with her right hand. The handle was worn smooth by 31 years of Ingrid's grip, and the wood was dark with oil and sweat, and the balance was perfect, the head heavy enough to move, silver and light enough to control. She positioned the edge of the disc where it met the top of the steak. She adjusted the angle, 30 degrees off vertical, wrist not arm, control not force. She struck. The ring filled the workshop, clear and bright and pure. The sound of polished steel on sterling silver on polished steel. The sound that traveled across the room and into the stone walls and out through the chimney and into the October morning. The first hammer blow in this workshop in 77 years. The first ring since Leif Dahl had put down his tools and hidden them behind the crucible wall and walked out into the October of 1947 and never come back. Wren rotated the disc 15 degrees. She struck again. Another ring. She rotated, she struck. The rhythm establishing itself the way a heartbeat establishes itself, not by decision but by necessity. The body knew the tempo, the hands knew the angle, the ears knew the sound. She went around the disc 8 times. The first round, 40 blows. The edge of the disc was turning downward over the stake, the beginning of the wall, the flat circle becoming a shallow dish. The marks were even. The spacing was consistent. The force was controlled. She was starting the second round when the silver told her something was wrong. Not wrong in the metal, wrong in her. She was rushing. The rhythm was too fast. She was hammering with urgency instead of patience, striking to prove something instead of striking to make something. The difference was invisible to anyone watching. The marks looked the same. The spacing was the same. But the sound was different. Not ring, not ping. Something between. A tightness in the tone that said the hammer was landing with tension instead of purpose. She stopped. She set the hammer down. She looked at the disc on the stake, the wall beginning to rise, the marks spiraling around the edge. She listened to the silence after the last ring faded. Patience is not optional, she said quietly, repeating Ingrid's words. Patience is structural. She picked up the hammer. She breathed. She struck clean, open, right. She continued, second round, third round, the wall rising, the disc becoming a bowl. At the end of the third round, the silver changed. The ring sharpened, the hammer bounced slightly instead of sinking. The silver was work-hardened. It needed to be annealed. She lit the torch. She held the bowl over the flame, rotating it slowly, watching the silver change color, straw, bronze, violet, and then the dull red glow that said 1100 degrees, the crystal structure softening, the metal exhaling. She quenched it in the bucket. The water hissed and steamed, and the bowl came out dark with oxidation and soft again. She set it back on the stake. She struck, soft and open and ready. Fourth round, fifth round, sixth round, annual, seventh round, eighth round, ninth round, annual. The wall was 3/4 up now. The disc was becoming a vessel. Each round lifting the silver higher, each blow pushing the metal inward and upward, the shape emerging from the flat the way a thought emerges from silence. Not added, revealed, and then on the 11th round she heard it. Not ping, not ring, a sound she had never heard before, a flat dead tone like a bellow with a crack in it. The silver was not work hardened. The silver was failing. She stopped, she looked at the bowl, and she saw it, a hairline crack on the inside wall about an inch below the lip running horizontally across 3 hammer marks. The crack was thin as a thread and dark as a vein, and it meant the bowl was dead. She stared at the crack for a long time. She held the bowl in her left hand and the hammer in her right, and she looked at the crack and understood what had happened. She had annealed too late. The ninth round had been one round too many before the third annealing. The silver had been telling her, and she had not listened. She had been thinking about Gunnar Dahl and his claim, and she had missed the moment when the ring tightened toward ping. She had pushed past. Silver had cracked. Harald's disc, cut in 1945, 80 years old, the last piece of silver her great-grandfather had ever touched. Cracked, unrepairable. A cracked vessel cannot be repaired, it can only be melted and started over. But this could not be started over. This was not stock silver from a refiner. This was Harald's silver. Harald's hands had cut this disc. Harald's shears had trimmed the edge. And now it was cracked because Wren had not listened to the metal, because she had let the noise in her mind drown out the sound of the hammer. She set the cracked bowl on the workbench. She set the hammer beside it. She walked outside and sat on the flagstone step and looked at the bay. The water was gray. The sky was gray. The birch trees were bare. She put her face in her hands and wept. Not for long. She wept for 10 minutes. Then she stopped. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She stood up. She walked back into the workshop. She looked at the cracked bowl on the bench. And then she did the hardest thing she had done since the night she slept on the marina bench with $1 in her pocket. She put the cracked bowl on the shelf. She did not melt it. She did not hide it. She put it on the shelf where she would see it every day, because the crack was not failure to be erased. The crack was a lesson to be remembered. The lesson was listen. The lesson was the silver tells you when to stop, and if you do not stop, the silver breaks, and the breaking is your fault, not the silver's. Then she took $63 from the coffee can where she kept her cash money she had set aside from the gold coins for weekly supplies, and she drove to Traverse City and bought a sheet of sterling silver from the metal supply. New silver, no history, no grandfather's hands, just metal. She drove back to the workshop. She cut a 4-inch disc from the sheet stock using lathe shears. The shears were heavy and sharp, and they cut the sterling cleanly, the blade moving through the metal with the steady authority of a tool that had been sharpened by a man who understood that a clean cut was the beginning of a clean raise. She filed the edges smooth. She flattened the disc on the workbench with a rawhide mallet, tapping gently, uniformly, removing the slight curl that the shearing had introduced. Then she clamped the stake. She placed the disc. She picked up the hammer. This time she listened. She raised the new bowl over 3 days, working slowly, deliberately, stopping at every hint of resistance in the meta and kneeling before the silver asked for it rather than after. She was not rushing, she was not proving anything, she was making something, and the difference between proving and making was the difference between tension and purpose, and the hammer knew the difference even if the mind sometimes forgot. On the second day, at the beginning of the 6th round, she heard the faintest tightening in the ring, so subtle she might have missed it a week ago before the crack, before the lesson. She stopped immediately. She lit the torch. She annealed, and when she set the bowl back on the stake and struck, the ring was open and ready and full, and she understood that the crack in Harald's disc had taught her something that Ingrid's words alone could not have taught her. Ingrid had said, listen. The crack had made her hear. The difference between the two was the difference between being told that fire is hot and putting your hand in the flame. One was knowledge, the other was knowing. The bowl came up clean, even walls, consistent marks, no cracks. She planished it on the 4th day, each blow of the flat-faced hammer compressing a raised mark, the rough surface smoothing under the steady percussion, the dimples disappearing into a surface that was continuous and reflective. 700 blows total, and when she held the finished bowl to the October light from the window, she could not see a single one. She placed the finished bowl on the workbench beside the cracked one. The 2 bowls sat side by side, one smooth and whole, one fractured, with a hairline running through the wall like a dark thread. She looked at them together, the failure and the success, the noise and the listening, both raised from 4-inch discs, both struck with the same hammer on the same stake. But one had been struck with a mind full of questions, and the other had been struck with ears that heard nothing but the silver. Both belonged on the workbench, both were the record. 3 weeks after his first visit, Gunnardal came back. He did not knock this time. The workshop door was open because rain was rising and the forge was hot and ventilation required the door open. She was on the 7th round of another bowl, this one from the same sheet stock, and the rhythm was steady and the sound was clean and the wall was rising evenly, and she did not hear his truck or his footsteps because when the hammer was ringing the world outside the ring did not exist. He stood in the doorway. She did not see him. He watched her raise for 10 minutes. He stood perfectly still with his hands at his sides and watched the hammer fall and the discs rotate and the ring filled the workshop and his face changed. The angular sharpness softened. The straight-backed certainty loosened. Something in his posture shifted the way a wall shifts when the mortar between the stones begins to give. He was watching something he had never seen. He was watching the craft his grandfather had practiced for 46 years, alive in motion in the hands of a 21-year-old girl in a workshop that had been silent for 77 years. When Wren reached the end of the round and paused to check the wall, she saw him. She did not startle. She set the hammer down and looked at him in the doorway with the November light behind him. "You raise like my grandfather," Gunnar said. His voice was different from the first visit. The certainty was still there, but the edge was gone. Same angle on the hammer, same rotation, same rhythm. "My grandmother taught me," Wren said, "and your grandfather taught her." Gunnar took a step into the workshop. He looked at the pattern book on the beam above the workbench. He looked at the two hammers side by side, Ingrid's and Leif's. "I didn't know that," Gunnar said. "I didn't know my grandfather taught anyone. My mother never told me. She said he worked alone." "He did work alone," Wren said, "except for 2 days in June 1945. He taught Ingrid Solberg, my grandmother, how to raise a pitcher. Her father, my great-grandfather Harald, sent her to learn because Harald knew his own limits." Wren opened the pattern book to the entry, June 14, 1945. She turned the book so Gunnar could read it. Gunnar read the entry. He read it again. His hand moved toward the page but did not touch it the way you reach toward something fragile, something that might dissolve if you press too hard. "This girl will be better than her father," Gunnar read aloud. "She may be better than me." He looked up from the page. "My grandfather wrote that." "Yes." "About your grandmother." "Yes." Gunnar looked around the workshop, the forge, the bench, the stakes, the pitch bed. His grandfather's tools arranged on the workbench by a young woman who knew how to use them because his grandfather had taught her grandmother how to use tools just like them 81 years ago. "I have a box at home," Gunnar said. "In Petoskey, a cardboard box my mother gave me before she died. It has my grandfather's birth certificate, his immigration papers from Norway, a photograph of him standing in front of this workshop in 1930. He's wearing a leather apron and holding a raising hammer. That photograph and the birth certificate are the only things I have of my grandfather. I never met him. He died in 1947. I was born in 1956, 9 years too late." He paused. He looked at the hallmark stamp on the workbench, the crowned L. "I have never held a raising hammer," Gunnar said. "I don't know what raising is. I don't know what planishing is. I don't know what annealing is. I know my grandfather was a silversmith because my mother told me, and because there is a photograph of a man with a hammer standing in front of a stone building. That is the entirety of my connection to Leif Dahl, a photograph and a name." He looked at Wren. "You know more about my grandfather's craft than I will ever know. You can hear the difference between a ready ring and a tired ping. You know when to anneal. You know why the 15th round changes angle. I don't know any of those things. I will never know them. I am 70 years old and my hands are the hands of an accountant. I spent 40 years in an office in Petoskey doing tax returns. These hands have never struck silver." The workshop was quiet. The forge ticked as it cooled. A gust of November wind moved through the birch trees outside and sent a scatter of dry leaves across the flagstone step. I still think the tools are mine, Gunnar said. By blood, by name, by right. But I came here today because I stood in that doorway for 10 minutes and watched you raise silver the way my grandfather raised silver, and I realized something that I did not expect to realize. He paused. The tools are alive when you use them. They are dead when I hold them. My grandfather did not hide dead things behind that wall. He hid living things, and living things belong with the person who keeps them alive. Wren waited. She could feel the moment the way you feel the moment before a hammer. Blow the weight of the hammer at the top of the arc the instant before gravity takes over and the steel falls. I'm not dropping the claim, Gunnar said. No, not yet. I need to think, but I wanted you to know that I saw what I saw, and what I saw was my grandfather's craft in your hands. And that means something. I don't know what it means yet, but it means something. He left. The truck went down the lane. The taillights disappeared through the birch trees. Wren stood at the workbench and picked up Leif's raising hammer, dull L stamped in the steel. She held it the way she held Ingrid's hammer at the end of the handle. The head balanced the weight familiar. The tool did not care whose hand held it. The tool cared only that the hand knew what to do. 2 weeks after Gunnar's second visit, Myron came. She did not call ahead. She did not write. She drove the 3 hours from Grand Rapids in the used Camry that smelled of mint, fluoride, and latex, and parked on the gravel lane, and walked to the workshop door and stood there in a wool coat that was too thin for November in Leelanau County, and looked at her daughter the way a woman looks at a child she has lost and found and lost again. Wren was at the bench planishing the stock silver bowl she had raised after Harald's disc had cracked. The planishing hammer tapping softly on the surface each blow, compressing a raised mark, smoothing the rough to the finished. She saw Maren in the doorway and stopped mid-blow. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The forge crackled. The wind moved through the birch trees. The bay was visible through the west window, gray and cold. You need to stop this, Maren said. Her voice was tight, controlled. The voice of a woman who had rehearsed what she was going to say for 3 hours in a car and was now saying it exactly the way she had practiced. This killed her, Wren, this workshop, this hammer, this forge. She died at that bench. She died with a hammer in her hand. She was 88 years old and her heart gave out because she spent 31 years standing at a workbench swinging a hammer. The doctor said her heart was enlarged. Do you know what that means? It means her heart was too big for her chest because she worked it too hard for too long. This craft killed my mother. Grandma didn't die because of the craft, Wren said. She died at the bench, Wren. She died holding the hammer. She died mid-stroke. How can you stand in a workshop that looks exactly like the one that killed her and tell me the craft didn't kill her? Wren set the planishing hammer down. She turned to face her mother. She was 21. Maren was 48. They looked alike in the way that a hammer looks like the stake. It strikes one shaping and one being shaped, each carrying the marks of the other. She didn't die because of the craft, Wren said again, and her voice was steady. The voice of a woman who had spent the last 2 months learning to listen to the sound of a hammer and trust what it told her. She died doing the craft. There's a difference. She died doing the thing she chose. The thing she was good at, the thing that mattered to her. She didn't die in a dentist's office smelling of someone else's mouth. She died at her own bench with her own hammer, making something with her own hands. The words landed. Wren saw them land. She saw Maren flinch, the way silver flinches when the hammer strikes too hard. I didn't mean it that way, Wren said. You meant it exactly that way, Maren said. The silence between them was the kind of silence that has weight, not the silence of an empty room, the silence of a room full of things that have been said and cannot be taken back. You sold the farm with a voicemail, Wren said quietly. 32 seconds. You sold everything Grandma built, everything Harald built, the workshop, the tools, the bench, the forge, the cherry tree she looked at every morning for 31 years, and you told me in a voicemail. I had debts, Ren. I know you had debts. I had a second mortgage. The clinic cut my hours. I was going to lose the apartment. I know. Then what did you want me to do? Maren's voice cracked, the rehearsed control breaking. Or keep the farm drive 3 hours every weekend to maintain 60 acres of cherry trees I don't know how to prune and a workshop full of tools I don't know how to use. I am not my mother, Ren. I never was. She tried to teach me. She put the hammer in my hand when I was 8, just like she put it in yours. And I hated it. I hated the noise and the heat and the smell. I wanted clean hands and a quiet room and a job that ended at 5 o'clock. That's not a crime. It's not a crime, Ren said, but the voicemail was. Maren looked at the workshop, the forge, the bench, the hammers, the pattern book. She looked at it the way a person looks at a language. They do not speak, recognizing the shapes of the letters but not the meaning. Who is Gunnar Dahl? Maren said. Ren looked at her mother sharply. How do you know that name? He called me. Last week he said he was Leif Dahl's grandson. He said you found tools in the wall. He said they belonged to his family. He asked me to talk to you. What did you tell him? Maren looked at the floor. I told him you were stubborn. I told him you got that from your grandmother. Despite everything, Ren almost smiled. Almost. I told him something else, Maren said. She reached into her coat and took out a small cardboard box about the size of a thick paperback book. She set it on the workbench beside the two raising hammers. When I sold the farm, I kept some things. Small things, things I thought I might want someday, even though I didn't want them then. This was one of them. Wren opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a dish towel, was a raising hammer, smaller than Ingrid's, older, the handle worn almost white with use, the crossbeam face polished to a mirror by decades of striking silver. That was your grandmother's first hammer, Maren said, the one Harald gave her when she was 8. She kept it on a nail above her bed at the farm. She never used it for raising after she got her full-size hammer. She kept it because it was the first tool she ever held. Wren picked up the hammer. It was light, a child's hammer. The handle fit her hand perfectly because she had small hands, always had the hands of a woman built for precision rather than force. And this hammer had been made for a child's hand, for an 8-year-old girl's hand, 83 years ago in a barn in Leelanau County. Why did you keep this? Wren asked. Maren did not answer immediately. She looked at the hammer in Wren's hand and something in her face shifted. Not softening, not hardening, something more complicated. The face of a woman watching her daughter hold the same tool her mother had held and feeling the line of it, the thread running from Harald to Ingrid to Wren, and understanding that the thread had skipped her, had passed through her without catching, and that the skipping was not a failure but a fact, and facts did not require forgiveness, only acknowledgement. I kept it because I thought if I hid the hammer, you wouldn't follow the craft, Maren said. I thought if I sold the farm and hid the tools and put 3 hours of highway between you and Leelanau County, you would find something else, something safe. Something that ended at 5 o'clock, something that wouldn't kill you at a workbench on a Saturday morning. She paused. I was wrong. You found a different workshop, you found different tools, you found the same craft. And you are standing at a bench in a stone building on a bluff above the bay, doing exactly what my mother did, and you are 21 years old, and I am terrified. I know, Ren said. I am not apologizing for selling the farm. I know, but I am sorry about the voicemail. The words hung in the workshop air between the forge smoke and the pitch smell and the faint, lingering scent of hot silver. Wren looked at her mother. Maren looked at the hammer in Wren's hand. The forge ticked. The wind moved the birch trees. Maren did not stay. She did not hug Wren. She turned and walked to her car and drove down the lane, through the birch trees and onto M22, heading south back to Grand Rapids, back to the clinic and the fluoride and the latex gloves. But she had come. She had brought the hammer. She had said what she had come to say. The box on the workbench was still open. 3 hammers now, Leif's, Ingrid's full size, and Ingrid's first, the child's hammer, the one Harald had put in an 8-year-old's hand. Wren placed the child's hammer beside the other two, 3 hammers in a row. 3 generations of striking, the handles worn by different hands but worn in the same place at the end where the grip is where the lever is longest and the control is greatest. She looked at the row of hammers and thought about Gunnardal standing in the doorway watching her raise with an expression she could not name, and Maren standing in the same doorway with a box in her hands and terror in her voice. 2 people standing in the same place, seeing the same thing and feeling opposite things. Gunnar seeing the craft he had never known, Maren seeing the craft she had always feared, and Wren in the middle holding the hammer. The days after Maren left were the days when Wren began to understand the difference between practicing a craft and living one. Practicing was what she had done at the farm, summers, school breaks. Ingrid standing beside her, correcting the angle of the hammer, adjusting the position of the disc, her voice steady and instructive and always patient. Practicing was learning in borrowed time in the margins of someone else's life, in a workshop that belonged to someone else, and a tradition that had not yet been handed over. Living the craft was different. Living was waking before dawn and lighting the forge, because the forge was the heat source and the heat source was the day. Living was eating breakfast on the workbench, because the workbench was the kitchen table and the kitchen table was the workbench, and there was no separation between the place where you ate and the place where you worked, because the work was the life and the life was the work. Living was walking to the outhouse behind the workshop in the November cold, because the workshop had no plumbing, and the outhouse was a cedar box with a tin roof that Mr. Tuomi had built 30 years ago for his orchard workers. And the walk from the workshop to the outhouse was 40 yards across frozen ground, and the cold entered your boots and traveled up your legs and reminded you every morning that this was not a summer visit, this was winter, this was permanent. She developed a routine: up before dawn, light the forge, heat water on the firebox for coffee, eat bread and butter and dried cherries from Mr. Tuomi's last batch, read one entry from the pattern book while the forge heated, then work. The work itself had a structure that she had not planned, but that emerged from the silver the way a form emerges from a flat disk, naturally, inevitably, each step leading to the next. She raised in the morning when her arms were fresh and her ears were sharp, and the light from the east window fell across the workbench at the right angle for watching the marks. She annealed in the late morning when the forge was at its hottest and the fire brick was radiating a steady, even heat that made the annealing faster and more uniform. She planished in the afternoon when the west window light was low and even, and the flat face of the planishing hammer needed the most consistent illumination to show the surface as it smoothed. She chased in the late afternoon if the piece needed chasing, sitting at the pitch bed with lace sponges and the fine-grained patience that chasing demanded, each stroke a precise tap, each tap moving the silver a thousandth of an inch. The pattern emerging from the surface, the way braille emerges from paper, a shape you could feel before you could see. In the evening, she cleaned tools. She oiled the hammers and the stakes and the vise. She swept the flagstone floor. She banged the forge and laid the morning's coke in the firebox so it would catch quickly when she lit it at dawn. She read the pattern book, she wrote in it, she sat on the cot and watched the forge glow and listened to the stone walls tick as they cooled and thought about silver. She thought about silver the way a farmer thinks about soil, not as a material to be used, but as a partner to be understood. Silver had properties, silver had behavior, silver had preferences, if you could call them that, ways it wanted to move and ways it resisted moving. And a smith who understood the difference between the two could raise a vessel that was true, and a smith who did not understand would fight the metal and lose. She was learning the properties of the silver she could buy in Traverse City, which was different from the silver Ingrid had used and different again from the silver Leaf had used. Modern sterling was harder at the start. It worked harder and faster. It needed more frequent annealing. The crystal structure was tighter, probably because of the refining process, and the tighter structure meant the metal had less give on the first few rounds of raising. But after the first anneal, the modern silver opened up and became responsive, and by the third round it raised as smoothly as any silver she had worked with at Ingrid's farm. She kept notes. She recorded the behavior of each disc she raised the way a winemaker records the behavior of each vintage. Disc at November 12th, stock from Traverse City Supply, slightly harder than the last sheet. First round required 10% more force to move the edge. Annealed after round 2 instead of round 3. After annealing, the metal is soft and responsive. Good silver, races clean. These notes went into the pattern book alongside her entries about finished pieces, building a record that was both technical and personal. The way Leaf's book was both technical and personal because a pattern book is not a recipe book. A pattern book is a diary of a relationship between a human hand and a sheet of metal, and the relationship changes with every disc and every hammer and every fire, and the notes are how you remember what the silver taught you. The work was solitary, but it was not lonely. Solitary and lonely were different things. The way raising and stamping were different things. Stamping was pressing a die into sheet metal fast and uniform and impersonal. Raising was striking the metal with a hammer, slow and individual and intimate. Solitary was working alone because the work required it, because the concentration of raising could not be divided, because the sound of the hammer had to be the only sound in the room, or the ear could not hear the difference between ready and tired. Lonely was wanting company and not having it. Wren was solitary, she was not lonely. The hammer was company, the forge was company, the pattern book was company, Leaf's voice reaching across 77 years to comment on the weather and the quality of the silver and the difficulty of chasing cherry blossoms during a fireworks display. And the community came to her. Mr. Tuomi on Saturdays, Mrs. Lindquist once a month. The mail carrier, a young man named Johansson, who drove the rural route along M22 and left Wren's mail in a tin box at the bottom of the lane, and who had started walking up the lane on Tuesdays to bring the mail directly because he had heard the hammer ringing from the road and wanted to know what made the sound. He stood in the doorway for 2 minutes the first time watching, and then he left the mail on the step and walked back down without a word. The next Tuesday he stayed for 5 minutes. The Tuesday after that he asked what she was making. By December he was bringing his lunch and eating on the step while Wren raised, and the two of them would sit in a silence that was comfortable and specific, the silence of two people who did not need to talk because the hammer was talking. The next week Sigrid Nygaard came to the workshop. Sigrid owned a fine craft gallery in Leland, a small white building on the main street with wide windows and track lighting and the kind of curated stillness that made you lower your voice when you walked in. She sold ceramics, woodwork, hand-blown glass, and a small amount of silver jewelry that she bought from a supplier in Grand Rapids. Factory-made pieces, clean and commercial and identical. Sigrid had heard about Wren from Mrs. Lindquist, who had heard about the raising from Mr. Tuomi, who had heard the hammer ring from his cherry orchard below the bluff one October morning, and had stood among his bare trees and listened for 20 minutes because the sound was the sound his wife had described once years ago when she had talked about the silver pin Ingrid had made for her 50th birthday and the warmth she could feel in the metal. Sigrid drove to the workshop on a Tuesday afternoon. She parked on the gravel lane and walked to the open door and stood where Gunnar had stood and where Maren had stood and watched Wren raise. But Sigrid watched differently. Sigrid watched the way a gallery owner watches, with the eye that measures not the making but the made. She watched the bowl take shape. She watched the planishing begin. And when Wren was done and held the finished bowl to the light, Sigrid said one thing. There are no hammer marks. The surface is continuous. How many blows? About 500 raising and 200 planishing, Wren said. 700 blows, Sigrid said, and I can't see one. That's the standard. The evidence of the making disappears into the finish. The marks are still there, Wren said. You can't see them, but they're in the metal. Planishing doesn't remove the marks, planishing absorbs them. Sigrid offered Wren 2 days a week at the gallery, making silver jewelry and small vessels, not factory pieces, handmade, raised, planished, hallmarked with the crown W. It was the first money Wren would earn from silver, the first time the craft would pay. The first step on the path that Harald had walked when he stopped picking cherries because the silver paid more, and that Ingrid had walked for 31 years in the barn on the bluff. But Sigrid also told Wren something else, and the something else landed harder than the job offer. A man named Gunnar Dahl came to the gallery last month, Sigrid said, and her voice was careful. He told me he has a legal claim to tools in this workshop. He asked me not to hire you. He said hiring you would complicate his case. Wren set down the planishing hammer. He said he wasn't threatening, Sigrid continued. He said he was informing. But there isn't much distance between informing and threatening when a 70-year-old man with a lawyer drives to your gallery and tells you not to hire someone. The forge was cooling. The light through the west window was going amber. The bay was darkening from blue to steel. Wren looked at the three hammers on the bench, side by side, and thought about Gunnar Dahl, standing in the doorway saying the tools are alive when you use them, and then driving to a gallery in Leland to tell the owner not to hire the woman who made them alive. The fight was not over. The fight had changed shape the way silver changes shape under the hammer, but it was not over. Gunnar had seen the craft and been moved by it, but seeing and surrendering were different things, and a man who has spent 70 years carrying a dead grandfather's name does not let go of the only claim he has because a young woman swings a hammer well. Wren picked up Ingrid's raising hammer. She turned it in the light, the handle dark with 31 years of grip, the head worn smooth. She placed the hammer back on the bench. She picked up Leif's hallmark stamp, the crowned L. She held it in her palm. The steel was warm from the dying forge light. I'll take the job, Wren told Sigrid, and I'll deal with Gunnar Dahl. This workshop is not going quiet again. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in December, 3 weeks after Sigrid Nygaard offered Wren the job at the gallery. Gunnar Dahl had filed a formal claim with the Leelanau County Probate Court requesting the return of all personal property belonging to Leif Dahl found within the workshop on Dahl Lane, including but not limited to hand tools, a leather-bound pattern book, a silver serving spoon, and a hallmark stamp bearing the initials LD. The filing was precise. The language was careful. Gunnar had hired a lawyer from Petoskey, a man named Strand, who specialized in estate and property disputes, and Strand had constructed the case on a single argument. The tools had been hidden, not abandoned. Hidden property retains the ownership of the person who hid it, and upon that person's death, ownership transfers to the legal heirs. Gunnar Dahl was Leif Dahl's only living heir. The tools were his. Wren could not afford a lawyer. She had the gallery job 2 days a week, and she had sold 3 small silver pieces in Sigrid's shop in the first 2 weeks, 2 pairs of earrings and a ring, each one raised from a tiny disc and planished and hallmarked with the crown W. The pieces had sold quickly because the tourists who came through Leland in the early winter were the kind of people who recognized handmade when they held it, and Wren's silver was handmade in a way that the factory pieces in the case beside it were not. But 3 small pieces did not pay for a lawyer. 3 small pieces paid for coke and sheets, silver and groceries and gas for the Ford Ranger, and that was all. She would represent herself. She did not tell anyone this decision. She did not discuss it with Mrs. Lindquist or Sigrid or Mr. Tuomi. She made the decision the way she made decisions about silver, alone at the workbench, with the forge warm and the hammers on the bench and the pattern book open in the quiet where the thinking was clearest. In the 3 weeks before the hearing, Wren worked. She raised silver at the workshop 3 days a week and made pieces for Sigrid's gallery 2 days a week, and spent the other 2 days reading Leif's pattern book from front to back, not for the patterns but for the man. She wanted to understand who Leif Dahl had been, not as a silversmith, but as a person who had decided at the end of his life to hide everything he valued behind a wall of fire brick and leave it for a stranger. The pattern book told her. Not in the patterns themselves, which were technical and precise, but in the quality notes, the one-line observations Leif had added at the bottom of each entry. These were the remarks of a man talking to himself across 46 years, and they revealed a mind that was meticulous, self-critical, and deeply in love with the work. September 12, 1903, candlestick pair for the Pedersen wedding. 7-inch shaft raised from a 4-inch disc, walls too thin at the base, must reduce force in the first 3 rounds. The hammer does not know the difference between a wall and a base, but the smith must. April 4th, 1919, cherry bowl for Mrs. Lindquist at the general store. Not the current Mrs. Lindquist, Wren realized, but perhaps her grandmother or great aunt. Chase work improving. The blossoms are beginning to look like blossoms instead of circles with lines. Another 5 years and they may look like flowers. November 1st, 1935. The Solberg baby spoon. Harald's daughter Ingrid is born this week. Harald asked for a spoon with a crowned S hallmark. I told him the hallmark must be the maker's mark, not the recipient's. He said the baby is the maker. She will make everything she touches. I made the spoon with a crowned S. Harald is sometimes right. Wren read that entry and sat still at the bench for a long time. Leif had made a spoon for Ingrid's birth, with a crowned S for Solberg. The connections between the two families were deeper than she had known, deeper than Ingrid had told her, deep as the roots of the cherry trees on the bluff. She also found entries that showed the change Leif had seen coming, the reason he had hidden his tools. March 15, 1940, the Traverse City Hardware now sells stamped silver bowls from a factory in Ohio, $6 each. My bowls take 2 days and cost $15. The bowls from Ohio are smooth and identical. My bowls carry the marks of my hand. I do not know which the customer will choose, but I know which bowl will last. August 8, 1946. Fewer orders this year. The factory silver is everywhere now. The gift shops carry it because it is cheap and it is uniform, and the tourists do not know the difference between stamped and raised. The tourists do not know that a stamped bowl is sheet metal pressed into a die, and a raised bowl is sheet metal transformed by a human hand, one blow at a time. The tourists see 2 silver bowls, they see a price. They choose the cheaper one. I do not blame them. I blame the factories for making a thing that looks like my thing but is not my thing and never will be. October 7th, 1947. 2 days before the final letter, I have decided. The tools go behind the wall, the pattern book goes behind the wall, the last spoon goes behind the wall, the savings go behind the wall. There is no one to leave them to. My daughter does not raise silver. She married a school teacher in Petoskey, and they have a good life, and I am glad of it. But the tools should not go to someone who will put them in a box in an attic. The tools should go to someone who will use them. If no one comes, the tools will wait. Fire brick does not burn, silver does not corrode, and a good hammer outlasts the hand that holds it. Wren closed the book. Leif's daughter had married a schoolteacher in Petoskey, Gunnar's father. The daughter who did not raise silver had raised a son who did not raise silver, and the son had raised a grandson who did not raise silver, and now the grandson was 70 years old and claiming the tools because his name was Dahl, and the tool said Dahl, and in his mind the name was the claim, and the claim was enough. But Leif had written there is no one to leave them to. He had known. He had known that his daughter would not carry the craft, and he had not blamed her, and he had not resented her, and he had not tried to force her. He had simply hidden the tools and written raise something and trusted that the right person would come. The courtroom was in Leland, a small room in the county building with wood-paneled walls and a single window that looked out onto a parking lot. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Estelle Haugen, who had been on the county bench for 20 years and who was known for two things, thoroughness and silence. She listened more than she spoke, she read more than she asked, and her decisions when they came were dense with reasoning and difficult to appeal. Gunnar sat on the left side of the courtroom with Strand beside him. He wore a dark suit and a white shirt, and his posture was the same straight-backed certainty Wren had seen at the workshop door in October, but his face was different. There was something in it that had not been there before. A hesitation, a crack in the certainty hairline, thin like the crack in Harald's disc, present but not yet fatal. Wren sat on the right side alone. She wore the cleanest clothes she owned, a flannel shirt and dark jeans and work boots, and she had brought a canvas bag and set it on the table in front of her. Strand spoke first. He laid out the legal argument with the efficiency of a man who had made the same argument many times in many courtrooms. Hidden property, retained ownership, heirs' rights. He cited 3 precedent cases in which items concealed within a structure had been returned to the estate of the person who concealed them, even when the structure had changed hands. He spoke for 12 minutes. His argument was clean and logical and probably correct. Judge Haugen listened without interrupting. She made notes on a yellow pad. When Strand finished, she looked at Wren. Miss Solberg, you are representing yourself. Yes, Your Honor. Do you understand the claim against you? Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Dahl is saying the tools belong to his family because his grandfather hid them. That is the essence of it. Do you wish to respond? Wren stood. She opened the canvas bag. She took out 3 objects and placed them on the table one at a time. The first was the silver serving spoon, Leif Dahl's last piece. The bowl raised from a single disc, the handle forged and tapered, the crowned owl hallmark on the back of the handle sharp and clean after 77 years. The second was the christening cup, Ingrid's piece made in 1991 for Mrs. Lindquist's daughter. Wren had borrowed it the week before. Mrs. Lindquist had handed it to her without hesitation and said, "Bring it back when you're done and don't let anyone touch it who doesn't know what planishing means." The crowned eye hallmark on the bottom sharp and clean after 35 years. The third was the bowl, Wren's bowl, the one she had raised from stock silver after Harald's disc had cracked. 4 inches across, planished, smooth, the crown W hallmark on the bottom, 3 pieces, 3 hallmarks, 3 generations of the same craft made by 3 different smiths in 2 different workshops using the same techniques, the same tradition that reached back 300 years to a village outside Gothenburg. Your Honor, Wren said, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to say this the way a silversmith would say it, and I hope that's all right. Judge Haugen nodded. This spoon was made by Leif Dahl in 1947. It was the last piece he ever made. He raised the bowl from a flat disc, forged the handle, planished the surface, and pressed his hallmark into the silver. The crowned L. Then he hid the spoon behind the crucible wall along with his tools, his pattern book, his savings, and a letter. The letter said raise something. It did not say return something. It said raise something. She touched the christening cup. This cup was made by my grandmother Ingrid Solberg in 1991. Ingrid learned to raise silver from 2 people. Her father Harald Solberg, who taught her the basics when she was 8, and Leif Dahl, who taught her the advanced technique of raising a pitcher when she was 10 because Harald knew that Ingrid needed more than he could give and he sent her to the best smith in the county. Leif wrote about it in his pattern book, June 14, 1945. He wrote that Ingrid would be better than her father. He wrote that she might be better than him. She touched her own bowl. This bowl is mine. I raised it 3 weeks ago from stock silver I bought with dishwashing money. I used the same technique Leif Dahl used. The same technique he taught my grandmother. The same technique my grandmother taught me. I raised it on Leif's workbench using Leif's stake holes in front of Leif's forge. I planished it with my grandmother's hammer, and I pressed my hallmark into the bottom, the crowned W. She placed her hand flat on the table beside the 3 pieces. Mr. Dahl is asking for his grandfather's tools. I understand why. His grandfather died 9 years before Mr. Dahl was born. He never met Leif. He never saw him raise silver. He never heard the hammer. The tools are the only physical connection he has to a man he never knew, and I understand what that means. I understand it because I lost my grandmother 3 years ago, and the only things I have of hers are 2 hammers and the sound of her voice telling me to listen to the metal. She paused. She looked at Gunnar. He was watching her. The crack in his certainty had widened. But those tools are not museum pieces. They are not heirlooms. They are not decorations. They are working tools. They were made to be used. Leif used them for 46 years. Every day, every blow, every piece. And when he hid them behind the wall, he did not write, "Keep these safe." He did not write, "Give these to my family." He wrote, "Raise something." He hid them for a smith, not for an heir, for a smith. She looked at Judge Haugen. I am a smith. I am the only smith in this room. I am the only person in this room who can pick up Leif Dahl's raising hammer and raise a vessel from a flat disc the way he raised it for 46 years. Mr. Dahl has his grandfather's name. I have his grandfather's craft. And I am asking the court to decide which one of those things Leif Dahl valued more, because I believe the answer is in the letter, and the letter says raise something. She sat down. The courtroom was silent. The furnace hummed behind the walls. The window showed the parking lot gray and empty. Judge Haugen looked at the 3 silver pieces on the table. She looked at Gunnar. She looked at Ren. Mr. Dahl, Judge Haugen said, "Do you wish to respond to Miss Solberg's statement?" Strand leaned toward Gunnar and whispered something. Gunnar shook his head. He put his hand on Strand's arm, a quiet gesture that said, "Stop, I will speak for myself." Gunnar stood. He buttoned his suit jacket. He looked at the 3 silver pieces on the table, the spoon and the cup and the bowl, 3 hallmarks in a row, 3 crowned letters, L and I and W, and his face was the face of a man who had come to a courtroom to claim something and had found something else entirely. My grandfather died on October 11, 1947, Gunnar said. 2 days after he wrote that letter, 2 days after he hid those tools behind the wall. He had a heart attack at his home a quarter mile down the lane from the workshop. My mother was 22. She was pregnant with my uncle. She did not know about the tools behind the wall. She did not know about the letter. She brought the key to the clerk's office and said, "Give it to whoever hears the hammer," because those were my grandfather's words to her. "Give the key to whoever hears the hammer." Gunnar paused. He looked at the hallmark stamp on Ren's table, the crowned L, his grandfather's name in steel. "I have spent my life carrying my grandfather's name," Gunnar said. "Dahl, it's on my birth certificate. It's on my tax returns. It's on 40 years of accounting files in Petoskey. I have carried the name, but I have never carried the craft. I don't know how to raise silver. I don't know what aniolin means. I thought the name was enough. I thought carrying the name was the same as carrying the legacy." He looked at Ren. 3 weeks ago, I stood in the doorway of my grandfather's workshop and watched this young woman raise silver. I stood there for 10 minutes. I watched the hammer fall. I watched the disc rotate. I heard the ring, and I understood for the first time in my life what my grandfather did for 46 years. Not the word silversmith, not the concept of racing, the actual sound of it, the ring of the hammer on silver. I had never heard it before. I am 70 years old, and I heard my grandfather's craft for the first time 3 weeks ago in the hands of a 21-year-old girl who is not related to me, who has no Dahl blood, who bought the workshop for $1.
The courtroom was very quiet. Strand sat with his pen motionless above his notepad. Judge Haugen's hand had stopped writing. I came here today to claim my grandfather's tools, Gunnar said. I believed they were mine. By blood, by name, by right, I hired a lawyer. I filed a claim. I built a case. And the case is sound. Mr. Strand's argument is legally correct. I believe that hidden property does retain the ownership of the person who hid it. He paused. But my grandfather did not hide those tools from someone. He hid them for someone. The letter does not say keep these. The letter says raise something. And the key my mother brought to the clerk's office in 1948, the key that sat in a drawer for 77 years until this young woman walked in with $1, the key came with words, give it to whoever hears the hammer. Gunnar unbuttoned his suit jacket. He reached into the inside pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it and looked at it for a moment and then held it out toward Judge Hogan. This is a signed withdrawal of my claim, Gunnar said. Effective immediately, I am withdrawing the petition. The tools belong to the workshop. The workshop belongs to Miss Solberg, and Miss Solberg is the person who hears the hammer. He set the paper on the judge's bench, then he turned to Wren. I have one request, Gunnar said, and it is not a legal request. It is a personal one. I would like to come to the workshop and watch you raise silver, once, so that I can hear my grandfather's hammer the way it was meant to be heard, not in a courtroom, in the workshop where he used it for 46 years. Wren looked at the old man in the dark suit with the straight back and the cracked certainty and the eyes that were not dry. You can come whenever you want, Wren said. The door is open. Judge Haugen looked at the withdrawal. She looked at both parties. She noted the withdrawal for the record and closed the hearing. Strand packed his briefcase in silence. Gunnar walked out of the courtroom without speaking to his lawyer. Wren put the 3 silver pieces back in the canvas bag. She carried them out to the Ford Ranger in the parking lot and set the bag on the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel and looked through the windshield at the gray December sky and breathed. She returned the christening cup to Mrs. Lindquist the next morning. Mrs. Lindquist took it and held it to the light and turned it once, checking the way a mother checks a child who has been out in the world and come back, and then she set it on her desk and looked at Wren. He withdrew, Mrs. Lindquist said. It was not a question she had already heard. He withdrew, Wren said. His mother would have been proud of him, Mrs. Lindquist said. She was a quiet woman. She understood things she couldn't explain. She understood why her father hid those tools. She just couldn't say it out loud, but Gunnar said it in a courtroom, in front of a judge. That takes a different kind of courage than raising silver, but it's courage all the same. Gunnar came to the workshop on a Saturday in January. The bay was frozen near the shore, a shelf of white ice extending 50 yards from the beach before the dark blue open water began. The birch trees were bare and white against the gray sky, their branches clicking in the wind. The workshop was warm. Wren had lit the forge an hour before dawn, and the fieldstone walls had absorbed the heat, and the room was dry and close and smelled of coke and hot metal. Wren had prepared. She had cut a 5-inch disc from sheet stock, the size for a proper bowl, larger than anything she had raised since coming to the workshop. She had selected Leif's raising hammer, not Ingrid's. She wanted Gunnar to hear his grandfather's hammer, the specific hammer, the specific ring. Gunnar arrived at 9. He knocked, the door was open. Wren told him to come in. He wore a heavy wool coat and a knit cap, and he carried a thermos of coffee and 2 ceramic mugs, and he set them on the windowsill beside Leif's last spoon, which caught the January light and threw a bright line across the flagstone floor. Where should I sit? Gunnar asked. Anywhere you can see the stake, Wren said. He pulled the folding chair to a spot near the pitch bed about 6 feet from the workbench, close enough to see the hammer fall and hear the ring, but far enough not to be in the way. He sat down and folded his hands in his lap and waited. Wren clamped the mushroom stake in the bench vise. She placed the 5-inch disc on the stake. She picked up Leif's raising hammer with her right hand, Dal L.
the handle dark with 46 years of Leif's grip, the cross-beam face polished by a million blows. She positioned the disc, she adjusted the angle, she breathed, she struck. The ring filled the workshop. It filled it the way sunlight fills a room when a curtain is drawn completely and at once. The sound of Leif Dahl's hammer on sterling silver on a polished steel stake, the sound that had filled this room for 46 years, and that had been silent for 77 years, and that was not silent now. Gunnar's hands tightened in his lap, his jaw set, his eyes did not leave the hammer. Ren rotated the disc. She struck again, the rhythm steady, the angle consistent, the force controlled. 30 degrees of vertical, wrist not arm, each blow pushing the silver over the stake, each rotation moving the blow point around the circumference, the disc turning, the silver moving, the wall beginning, first round 40 blows, second round 40 blows, the edge of the disc curling downward, the flat becoming a dish, the dish becoming a bowl. Gunnar watched without speaking. He watched the way a man watches a fire or a river or the sea, something that moves by its own law, something that does not need an audience but permits one. His face was still, his eyes were wet, he did not wipe them. Third round. The silver beginning to harden, Ren stopped. She lit the torch. She held the bowl over the flame, rotating it slowly, watching the color change. Straw, bronze, violet, dull red. She quenched it. The water hissed. She set the bowl back on the stake and struck, soft and open and ready. She continued, round after round, anil after anil, the wall rising, the bowl taking shape, the silver responding to the hammer the way it had responded to Leif's hammer, because the silver did not know the difference between 1947 and the present day, and the hammer did not know the difference between Leif's hand and Ren's hand, and the ring was the same ring, the same frequency, the same vibration moving through the same steel into the same stone walls. 12 rounds, 14 rounds, the bowl was formed, the wall even, the lip clean, the raising was done. Ren switched to the planishing hammer, Ingrid's hammer, the flat, polished face. She began planishing each blow, compressing a raised mark, the rough surface smoothing under the steady percussion of the flat face. The sound changed. Not a ring now, a tap, softer, lighter, the sound of finishing rather than making. 200 blows, the surface transforming, the dimples disappearing, the rough absorbing into the smooth. The evidence of the making vanishing into the finish, not erased but absorbed, still present in the metal, invisible to the eye, permanent in the structure. When she finished, she held the bowl to the January light from the window. The surface was continuous, mirror bright, no hammer marks visible, the wall even, the lip clean, 700 blows total and not one visible. She set the bowl on the bench. She picked up a hallmark stamp, not the crowned W, not the crowned L. A new stamp. She had carved it herself 2 nights ago at the workbench by forge light using a small steel blank and Leif's engraving tools from the tool roll. She had worked for 4 hours, cutting the design into the steel with the precision that Ingrid had taught her and the patience that the craft demanded. The new hallmark was a single crowned letter that was not a single letter. It was a W with a D nested inside it, the vertical strokes of the W forming the outer frame and the D sitting within the 2 letters, sharing the same space the way 2 families shared the same craft. W for Ren, D for Dahl, under a single crown. She placed the stamp on the bottom of the bowl. She struck it once with the chasing hammer. The mark pressed into the silver sharp and clean, the edges crisp. Permanent. A hallmark that would last as long as the silver lasted, and silver lasted forever. She held the bowl out to Gunnar. Your grandfather's tools raised this bowl, Ren said. Your grandfather's hammer made the ring you just heard. His craft is in this silver. I want you to have it. Gunnar took the bowl. He held it in both hands, the way you hold something that is heavier than its weight. He turned it over. He looked at the hallmark on the bottom, the crown W and D. He looked at it for a long time. What is this mark? Gunnar said. It's a new hallmark, Wren said. W for my name, D for yours, for your grandfather's. The tools taught me. The name should be on the work. Gunnar held the bowl in the January light. The silver caught the sun from the window and threw light across his face and across the field's stone walls and across the workbench where three raising hammers lay, side by side, Leif's and Ingrid's full size and Ingrid's first, the child's hammer, 3 generations of striking, 3 handles worn smooth by 3 different hands. My grandfather would have sold this, Gunnar said quietly. That's the standard, Wren said. Gunnar set the bowl on his knee. He looked at the workshop, the forge, the bench, the stakes, the pattern book hanging open above the workbench, the silver spoon on the window ledge, the crucible wall with the cavity still visible, the fire brick behind it, the hiding place that had held the tools for 77 years. I have one more thing to ask, Gunnar said, and I know I have no right to ask it, but I am asking. Ask, Wren said. Teach someone, Gunnar said, the way my grandfather taught your grandmother, the way your grandmother taught you, the way it's been passed for 300 years. Don't let it end with you. Find someone, put the hammer in their hand, let them strike until the striking becomes listening. Wren looked at the old man with the silver bowl on his knee and the wet eyes and the straight back that had finally, after 70 years, bent toward something he did not own but understood. I will, Wren said. Gunnar nodded. He wrapped the bowl in his scarf and placed it carefully inside his coat and stood and walked to the door. He stopped on the flagstone step and looked out through the birch trees toward the frozen bay. My mother said my grandfather could hear the thickness of the wall by the sound of the hammer, Gunnar said without turning around. Thick silver sounds dull, thin silver sounds bright. He kept the wall at exactly 20 gauge by listening. That's what my grandmother told me, Wren said. Gunnar nodded once. Then he walked down the lane to his truck and drove away through the white birch trees. The weeks after Gunnar's visit were the quietest weeks Wren had known since coming to the workshop. The legal claim was withdrawn. The gallery job was steady. Mr. Tuomi still came on Saturdays with coffee and dried cherries and the comfortable silence of a man who understood that presence was enough. Mrs. Lindquist stopped by once a month to check on the forge and tell stories about Leif Dahl and Ingrid and the silver pieces that still sat on mantles and in china cabinets across Lilla now. County hallmarks, sharp surfaces, untarnished, the craft outlasting the craftsman by decades. Wren raised silver. She raised bowls and cups and small vessels for the gallery, and each one was hallmarked with the crowned W, and each one sold, and the selling was not the point, but the selling paid for the coke and the silver and the food and the gas, and a craft that pays for itself is a craft that can continue, and continuing was the point. She read the pattern book every night, not for the patterns anymore. She had memorized the patterns she needed. She read it for the voice. Leif Dahl's voice, speaking across 77 years in small, precise handwriting, a man talking to himself about silver and work and time, and the relationship between a hammer and the metal it strikes. February 19, 1922. Repaired the bellows today. The leather was cracked along the fold. I cut a patch from a boot sole and riveted it in place. The bellows draws unevenly now, but it draws. A smith with a working forge and a weak bellows is a smith. A smith with a dead forge and perfect bellows is a man with a leather bag. December 3rd, 1938. Snow on the bluff. The chimney draws well in cold air. The cold creates a stronger draft because the temperature difference between the firebox and the outside is greater. Cold days are good forge days. The fire burns hotter, the silver anneals faster, the work moves. July 4th, 1944, Independence Day, no orders, raised a bowl for myself, 5-inch disc. Cherry blossom pattern, chased the blossoms while the fireworks sounded from Sutton's Bay. The concussions from the fireworks vibrated the pitch bed and I had to wait between bursts to chase. The punch marks are slightly uneven on the third blossom. I can see it. No one else will, but I will know. That entry made Wren smile, because it was the entry of a man who held himself to a standard that no customer would ever notice and no judge would ever enforce, a standard that existed only between the smith and the metal in the quiet where the hammer rings and the silver remembers. She began to write her own entries in the pattern book, not on Leif's pages. Those were his, and she would not write over them or between them. She wrote on the blank pages at the back of the book, the pages that had been waiting for 77 years for someone to continue the record. November 15th, small ball from 4-inch stock disc, 12 rounds, 40 blows per round, a nail every 3 rounds, planish 180 blows. First piece raised in Leif's workshop since 1947, the forge draws clean. The stakes fit the bench. The silver is from the Traverse City supply house. It raises well but feels different from the old silver. Newer stock is slightly harder, needs more annealing, must adjust. November 22nd, earrings for the gallery. Raised from half-inch discs, tiny raising, 12 blows per disc, 6 rounds, no annealing needed because the discs are so small the work hardening is minimal. Planished with the edge of the flat face hammer because the full face is too large for a half-inch bowl. Hallmarked with the crown W using the small punch. Sold both pairs the first day. December 1st, cup for practice, 4-inch disc, 14 rounds, 560 blows, wall thickness consistent except at the lip where I struck too close to the edge on the 12th round and pushed the metal outward instead of upward. Corrected on the 13th round, but the lip carries a slight flare, not visible after planishing. But I know, Leif would have known, Ingrid would have known, the standard is not what others see. The standard is what the smith knows. She wrote these entries in the same small, precise handwriting Leif had used, not because she was imitating him, but because the scale of the pages demanded it, and because a pattern book was a technical document, and technical documents required precision, and because there was something right about the handwriting of the student matching the handwriting of the teacher, the way the marks of the student's hammer matched the marks of the teacher's hammer, not identical but recognizable part of the same lineage. Winter settled on the bluff. The bay froze deeper. The birch trees stood white and bare against skies that were either gray or so blue they hurt. The workshop stayed warm because the forge was lit every day, and the fieldstone walls held the heat, and the heat held the smell, and the smell was the smell of a working silversmith's shop, coke and flux and silver and pitch, the smell that had been sealed in the walls since 1947 and that was now being renewed layer upon layer, the new smell on top of the old, the way new hammer marks overlay old hammer marks in the metal, not replacing but adding, not erasing but continuing. January was the coldest month. The thermometer that Mr. Tuomi had nailed to the birch tree outside the workshop door read -12 on the worst morning, and the wind came off the frozen bay and drove snow sideways through the birch trees and piled drifts against the workshop door that Wren shoveled every morning before dawn, the shovel scraping the flagstone step, the sound flat and percussive, nothing like the ring of silver. The Ford Ranger started on the 4th try that morning. The 5th try started on the 3rd. By the 6th try, Wren had learned to keep a blanket over the hood at night and to warm the engine block with a pan of coals from the forge set under the truck on a fire brick. A trick Mr. Tuomi taught her, a trick the cherry farmers had used for generations, because cherry farmers knew coal the way silversmiths knew silver intimately and without complaint. She drove to the gallery in Leland 2 days a week through the winter dark. The road along M22 was plowed but narrow, the snowbanks high on either side, the headlights of the Ranger cutting through the pre-dawn gray. Sigrid opened the gallery at 10, but Wren arrived at 8 to use the gallery's work table for the smaller pieces, the earrings and rings and brooches that required finer tools and better light than the workshop provided. The gallery had electricity, the workshop did not. Wren worked by forge light and window light, and in the evenings by the light of 2 kerosene lanterns that she had bought at the hardware store in Suttons Bay for $9 each. The lanterns threw a warm amber light across the workbench that was actually better for some operations than electric light because the amber softened the shadows and showed the surface of the silver in relief rather than in glare. And chasing work in particular was easier by lantern light because the low angle of the flame showed every punch mark as a shadow, and the shadows told you whether the mark was deep enough or whether the punch needed one more stroke. Sigrid sold 11 of Wren's pieces in January and February. The winter tourists were fewer, but they were serious. They came to Leelanau County for the cross-country skiing and the ice fishing and the stark beauty of the frozen lake shore, and they had time in the evenings to browse the galleries on the main street in Leland, and when they picked up one of Wren's bowls and turned it over and saw the hallmark and felt the weight and understood without being told that the bowl in their hands had been made by a single person striking silver 500 times in a stone workshop on a bluff above the bay, they bought it. Not because it was cheap. Wren's pieces were not cheap. A small bowl was $60, a cup was $80, earrings were $35 a pair. The prices were fair for handmade silver, but they were not impulse prices, and the tourists who paid them were paying for the hand in the metal, the warmth that Mr. Tuomi's wife had described. The thing you could feel in the silver that you could not feel in a stamped piece from a factory in Ohio. The income was not large, but it was steady and it was silver income money earned by the craft, and there was a satisfaction in that which went beyond the dollars. Harald had earned silver income. Ingrid had earned silver income. And now Wren was earning it, and the earning was part of the tradition because a craft that does not pay is a hobby, and a hobby does not survive the person who practices it. A craft survives because it earns, and the earning gives the craftsman the means to continue, and the continuing is how the craft passes from one generation to the next. In February, Gunnar Dahl sent Wren a letter, not a legal document. A personal letter handwritten on cream stationery mailed from Petoskey. The handwriting was neat and upright, the handwriting of an accountant, precise in a different way from Leif's precision, numerical rather than visual. Each letter formed with the care of a man who had spent 40 years writing numbers that had to be exact. Dear Miss Solberg, I hope this letter finds you well and that the workshop is warm. I know from my mother's stories that the winters on the bluff are hard, and I hope the forge is drawing well. I wanted to tell you that the bowl you made for me is on my mantle in Petoskey, beside the photograph of my grandfather standing in front of the workshop in 1930. The bowl catches the morning light from the east window and throws a bright line across the living room floor, the way my mother said my grandfather's silver used to throw light across the workshop floor when the doors opened and the afternoon sun came in. I showed the bowl to my neighbor, a retired teacher named Edwardson, who knows something about antiques. He turned it over and looked at the hallmark, the crown WD, and he said he had never seen a hallmark with two initials nested together. He asked what it meant. I told him it meant that the craft and the name had found each other after 77 years. He asked if you take commissions. His wife's birthday is in April. She collects handmade silver. I told him I would ask. I do not presume to send you business. I only pass along the inquiry. If you are interested, his name is Carl Edvardsen, and his number is below. Yours, Gunnar Dahl. Wren read the letter at the workbench by lantern light on a February evening. The forge banged for the night, the bay frozen and silent beyond the window. She read it twice. She set it on the bench beside the pattern book and looked at it for a while, and then she folded it and placed it inside the front cover of the pattern book beside Leif's letter. 2 letters, one from the grandfather who had hidden the tools, one from the grandson who had let them go, both written on cream stationery, both precise, both carrying a weight that the words on the page did not fully contain. She called Karl Edvardsen the next day from the payphone in Suttons Bay. He wanted a silver picture frame for his wife. Wren had never made a frame. She said yes. She spent a week figuring out the construction, studying Leif's pattern book for guidance, finding an entry from October 1931 where Leif had made a frame for a wedding portrait, and the entry described the technique, raising the bezel from a strip of flat stock, soldering the corners, fitting the back plate, and finishing the surface. Wren followed the entry like a map and made the frame and hallmarked it with the crown WD and mailed it to Petoskey in a box padded with newspaper, and Karl Edvardsen sent her a check for $120 and a note that said his wife cried when she opened it. That was the first commission that came through Gunnar. It was not the last. In March, Gunnar sent 2 more inquiries, a set of napkin rings for a couple in Harbor Springs, a small bowl for a doctor's wife in Charlevoix who had seen the bowl on Gunnar's mantle and wanted one. Wren made both pieces and shipped them, and the checks came, and the work continued, and the chain between the doll name and the Solberg hand grew stronger with each piece that went out into the world carrying the crown WD hallmark. Wren did not know if Gunnar was doing this deliberately, building a network of customers for her through his decades of connections in the small-town professional world of northern Michigan, or if he was simply a man whose mantle bowl attracted attention and who passed along inquiries because he was methodical and because passing things along was what an accountant did. She suspected it was both. She suspected that Gunnar Dahl, having surrendered his claim to the tools, had found a different way to carry his grandfather's legacy, not by holding the hammer, but by sending the world to the woman who did. In mid-March, Maren called. Not a voicemail this time, a phone call. Wren answered at the payphone in Suttons Bay, where she checked for messages once a week and heard her mother's voice, and the voice was different from the last time they had spoken in the workshop. The tightness was still there, the control, but there was something else underneath it, something that sounded like a woman who had been thinking for 4 months about a conversation in a stone building on a bluff and had arrived at a conclusion she had not expected. "I'm not calling to argue," Maren said. "I'm calling to tell you something." "Okay," Wren said. "I went to the Suttons Bay Lutheran church last Sunday. I don't go to church. You know that. I haven't been inside a church since your father left. But I drove up to Suttons Bay and I went to the Lutheran church and I asked the pastor if I could see the communion set." Wren was quiet. She knew what communion set Maren was talking about. "It's still there," Maren said. "The chalice and the paten and the 2 candlesticks. Leifdahl made them in 1929. The pastor showed them to me. He took them out of the cabinet and set them on the altar table, and I looked at them. The silver is still bright. The hallmarks are still sharp. The pastor said they've never been polished. He said the woman who made the christening cup for the Lindquist girl had told him the same thing Mrs. Lindquist told you, that if the planishing is good enough, the surface repels tarnish." "That's true," Wren said. "I held the chalice," Maren said. "The pastor let me hold it. I held it in both hands and I turned it and I looked at the surface and I could not see a single mark. Not one. And I thought about what you said in the workshop, about my mother dying at the bench, doing the thing she chose. And I looked at that chalice and I understood something I had not understood before." She paused. Wren could hear her mother breathing. She could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background, the sound of Grand Rapids, the sound of a city that was 3 hours and a lifetime away from the bluff. "The chalice is 97 years old," Maren said, "and it is still being used every Sunday. The hands that made it are gone. The man who made it has been dead for 79 years. But the chalice is still on the altar. People still drink from it, people still hold it and feel the weight of it and put it to their lips. The making is gone, the maid is still here. Yes, Wren said. Your grandmother's work is still here too. The christening cup on Mrs. Lindquist's mantle, the cherry blossom pin in Mrs. Tuomi's casket, the bowls in the gift shops. The things she made with her hands are still in the world, still being held, still carrying her hallmark. And I sold her workshop, I sold her tools, I sold the bench where she made all of those things, and I told you about it in a 32-second voicemail. Mom, Wren said. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Maren said. I sold the farm because I had to. I would sell it again. The debts were real. But I should have called you. I should have sat across from you at a table and told you face to face and let you be angry and let you grieve and let you ask me questions and let me answer them. I should have given you that. Instead, I gave you 32 seconds of my tired voice on a recording. And that was wrong. The payphone was cold against Wren's ear. The March wind was blowing off the bay, carrying the smell of thawing ice and wet sand. A seagull stood on the railing of the harbor dock and watched her with one eye. Thank you, Wren said, for what? For calling, for not leaving a voicemail. Maren made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. The ghost of a laugh, the way the ghost of coke smoke lingered in fire brick. Are you warm enough? Maren asked. In that workshop, it's still cold up there. The forge keeps it warm, Wren said. Good, Maren said. Good. They talked for 3 more minutes about nothing important. The weather, the roads, whether the cherries would bloom early this year. Then Maren said she had to get to the clinic, and Wren said she had to get back to the workshop, and they hung up, and the distance between them was still 3 hours of highway, but it was no longer the distance it had been, because a phone call is not a voicemail and a conversation is not a recording. And the difference between the two is the difference between a stamped vessel and a raised one. Both are silver, both are functional, but only one carries the hand. On a clear evening in late March, when the ice on Grand Traverse Bay had broken and the dark blue water was visible again from the workshop door, and the first buds were swelling on the cherry trees in Mr. Tuomi's orchard below the bluff, Wren sat on the flagstone step and watched the last copper light fade across the bay. The Manitou Islands were visible on the horizon, dark shapes against the copper sky. The air smelled of thawing earth and lake water and the faint smoke from the forge chimney because the forge was still warm from the afternoon's work. Inside the workshop on the workbench lay the piece she had been raising. A 6-inch cherry blossom bowl, the same size, the same pattern, the same design as the bow Ingrid had been raising when she died. The bowl that had been on the stake with the hammer in Ingrid's hand on that Saturday morning in November 3 years ago. The bowl that had never been finished. Wren was finishing it. Not Ingrid's bowl. Ingrid's bowl was still on the stake at the farm, wherever the farm's new owners had put it if they had kept it at all. Wren was raising a new one. Same pattern, same dimensions, same chasing design, 4 cherry blossoms on the outside, each one pressed into the silver with leaves, chasing punches on Leif's pitch bed, the petals curving outward the way real cherry blossoms curve on the branches of the Montmorency trees in Mr. Tuomi's orchard. She had found the pattern in Leif's book, May 3rd, 1928, cherry blossom bowl, 6-inch disc, 14 rounds, 42 blows per round, annual every 3 rounds. Plenish 200 blows, chase 4 blossoms on outside. The same bowl Leif had made in 1928, the same bowl Ingrid had been making when she died. The same pattern traveling across nearly 100 years from Leif's hands to Ingrid's hands to Wren's hands, the design unchanged because the cherry blossoms were unchanged and the silver was unchanged and the hammer was unchanged, and the only thing that changed was the hand that held the hammer, and the hand always learned the same lesson. The bowl was done, raised and planished and chased and polished. Wren had spent 2 days on the chasing alone, sitting at the pitch bed beside the west window in the afternoon light, pressing the blossoms into the silver with the fine-tipped punches, each petal a dozen strokes, each stroke a controlled tap of the chasing hammer on the punch head, the silver yielding beneath the steel, the pattern emerging the way a thought emerges from silence. She had not yet stamped the hallmark. She sat on the step and watched the copper light and held the hallmark stamp in her hand. The new one, the crowned WD. She turned it in the light. The steel caught the last sun and flashed once and went dark. She thought about Leif Dahl, who had stood at this forge for 46 years raising silver because he had understood that a stamped vessel and a raised vessel were not the same thing, and the difference was the hand. The 500 blows that lived inside the metal even after the planishing made them invisible. She thought about Harald, who had come from Gothenburg with the Swedish tradition and who had picked cherries for 3 years before the silver paid more, and who had known his own limits and sent his daughter to learn from someone better, because a man who loves his craft more than his pride will always send the student to the master. She thought about Ingrid, who had raised silver for 31 years and who had taught a 6-year-old girl to read the hammer marks on the bottom of a bowl because the marks were the record of the making and the record was in the metal forever. Who had died at her bench with the hammer in her hand mid-stroke, the last blow landing exactly where it needed to land. She thought about Maren, who had kept a child's hammer in a box for 3 years because she thought hiding the tool would hide the calling, and who had driven 3 hours to deliver it because she had learned that hiding a calling does not end it but only delays the moment when the called picks up the hammer and strikes. And she thought about Gunnar, who had carried a name for 70 years without carrying the craft, and who had stood in a doorway and heard a ring and understood for the first time what the name meant, and who had walked away from a courtroom with a bowl wrapped in a scarf inside his coat and something in his chest that had not been there before. That is the thing about the hammer our grandmothers teach us to hear. We do not always know when we are 6 years old and looking at the overlapping dimples on the underside of a silver bowl that the looking is itself the trade. We learn it slowly, summer by summer, blow by blow, and then 3 years after the old woman dies, we pull a stone from a crucible wall and find the tools of a man who raised silver for 46 years and who wrote a letter that said, "Raise something." And we understand what she had been teaching us. She had been teaching us that the hammer tells you when the metal is ready and when the metal is tired. She had been teaching us that planishing does not remove the marks but absorbs them. She had been teaching us that patience is structural, and the trade is the patience to trust that the 500th blow will complete what the first blow began. Wren stood up from the step. She walked into the workshop. She placed the cherry blossom bowl on the workbench under the light. She positioned the hallmark stamp on the bottom in the center where every hallmark belongs. She picked up the chasing hammer. She struck once. The mark pressed into the silver, clean, sharp, permanent. The crown diode cut in steel by her own hand, pressed into silver by her own hand in a workshop on a bluff above Grand Traverse Bay, where the first fire had been lit in 1901 and the last fire had never gone out. She opened Leif's pattern book to the last page she had written on, turned to the next blank page and wrote in small, clear handwriting, March 28th, cherry blossom bowl, 6-inch disc, 14 rounds, 42 blows per round, annual every 3 rounds, planish 200 blows, chase 4 blossoms on outside, Harald's tradition, Leif's pattern, Ingrid's technique, my hands. The silver from the Traverse City refiner raises clean. The cherry trees on the bluff are budding. Mr. Tuomi says it will be a good year for blossoms. I will make more bowls when the blossoms open so I can chase from life instead of memory. She closed the book. She hung it back on the nail above the workbench. She placed the 3 raising hammers side by side on the oak, Leif's, Ingrid's, the child's hammer. She placed the 3 hallmark stamps beside them, the crowned L, the crowned I, the crowned WD. She set the cherry blossom bowl on the window ledge beside Leif's silver spoon. The two pieces caught the last copper light from the bay. The spoon from 1947, the bowl from today. 77 years apart. The same craft, the same workshop, the same ring. On the shelf above Harald's cracked bowl sat where Wren had placed it months ago. The hairline crack still visible, the lesson still present. She did not hide it, she did not regret it. The crack was part of the record, the way a mist blow is part of the raising, absorbed into the whole, not erased but included, because a smith who has never cracked a disc is a smith who has never pushed hard enough to learn where the limit is, and knowing where the limit is how you stay inside it. Veren Solberg was 21 years old. She had been homeless. She had $1 to her name, and she had spent it on an abandoned silversmith's workshop on a lane in northern Michigan. She had found a dead man's tools behind a wall and a living craft inside herself. She had cracked a disc and raised a bowl and lost a grandmother and found a forge and fought for a workshop and won, not by winning, but by raising something which was the only answer the letter had asked for. She thought about the question from the beginning. Who owns what the dead leave behind, the blood that carries the name or the hand that carries the craft? And the answer she understood now, sitting on the step with the copper light fading and the cherry blossom bowl on the window ledge and the 3 hammers on the bench, was that the question was wrong. The dead do not leave things behind. The dead leave marks. Hammer marks on silver, hall marks on vessels, entries in pattern books, lessons spoken once in a July afternoon and remembered forever. The marks are not property, the marks are not inheritance. The marks are the record of a life spent making, and the record belongs to whoever can read it, and reading is what Ingrid had been teaching Wren since she was 6 years old, sitting on a wooden stool looking at the overlapping dimples on the underside of a silver bowl. The blood carries the name. Gunnar carried Dal. He would always carry Dal. It was on his mailbox in Petoskey and on his tax returns and on the bowl that sat on his mantle beside his grandfather's photograph. The name was his, and the name was real, and the name mattered. The hand carries the craft. Wren carried raising. She would carry it as long as her hands could hold a hammer and her ears could hear the difference between a ready ring and a tired ping. The craft was hers, and the craft was real, and the craft mattered. But the mark carries both. The crown WD on the bottom of the cherry blossom bowl was both the hand and the name, both the craft and the blood, both the girl who raised and the man whose tools she raised with. The mark said, I made this, and the I was plural because no smith works alone. Every smith works with the ghosts of every smith who held the hammer before. Harald's ghost was in Wren's grip, Ingrid's ghost was in Wren's ears. Leif's ghost was in the forge smoke and the pattern book and the silver spoon on the window ledge, and the marks they had left, the lessons and the techniques and the standards were not behind a crucible wall anymore. They were in the silver. They were in the world. They were in the ring of a hammer striking a disc on a stake in a workshop on a bluff above Grand Traverse Bay, and the ring was a sound that traveled through stone walls and across cherry orchards and out over dark water, and the ring said, Here. Here is the hand. Here is the craft. Here is the answer. Raise something. She sat on the cot and watched the forge glow and listened to the silence, and the silence was not empty. The silence was full. Full of the ring that had faded but had not gone, full of the marks that had been planished but had not disappeared, full of the 500 blows that were invisible but permanent, absorbed into the silver, absorbed into the surface, absorbed into the metal that remembers everything. The hammer tells it. The forge was warm, the bay was dark, the cherry trees on the bluff were budding, and in the morning she would light the fire and pick up the hammer and strike, and the ring would fill the workshop the way it had filled it for 125 years, and the ring would travel through the stone walls and across the bluff and down through the cherry orchard and out over the dark blue water of Grand Traverse Bay, and anyone listening, anyone who knew what the sound meant would hear it and would know. The workshop on Dal Lane was not quiet anymore.